We are paid, that's all. We are God.
Hey guys! This is Uruzi and this is part 6 of What If Naruto Conquers His Inner Demons. When Utakata discovers that Yagura is being manipulated by Akatsuki, he flees the hidden mist with the goal to save himself and his only friend. His solution? Find the other Jinchūriki and convince them to join his fight. But the Jinchūriki have more baggage than just the Bijū they contain, and if they can't create a cohesive unit from broken recluses, they may all be dead. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 14, The Beetle's Curiosity. The cavern's silence was broken only by the pained moans and groans of an emerald-haired woman lying on a flat rock. Flaming sconces illuminated a man with short, white blonde hair standing beside her, his two hands cradling her left, his sharp features wrestling between concern and stoicism with every flicker of the dancing firelight. Gray eyes flitted over to a second woman who was standing at the rock's foot and murmuring to the supine woman to keep pushing. Her cries increased in volume until they were finally joined by another, this one high-pitched and continuous, a long wail interspersed only by short hitches to breathe. One dark-skinned hand reached out to comfort her child, but a man with the wrinkles of late middle age swooped in and grabbed the babe from the midwife's arms. His hand came up to cradle the thin layer of mint-green fuzz on the newborn's head, though the gesture lacked any sort of comfort or care. "Takigakure thanks you for your contribution," he said to the new parents in a flat, stately voice. The father's expression was pinched, tight, every effort going into not reacting. He gave one stiff nod, the firelight glinting off the polished metal of his forehead protector, a sigil of his subservience. Newborn in his arms, the older male walked into an adjoining cavern, the mother's cries fading with distance while the baby's became more pronounced. 6 others watched him approach from their positions around a large stone pedestal, where an elaborate urn decorated with even more complex seals sat. He placed the newborn in a rocky bassinet one of his companions created with a few hand signs, then stepped into the open spot left for him to complete the circle. "Is everybody ready?" He received a chorus of agreements before turning to the woman next to him and giving her a nod. "Then begin." She gave a return nod, long, vibrant red hair and unlined facial features belying her true age. Her hands moved carefully through a long string of seals, her associates copying every movement. "Hak no Fuin Shiki." Chakra burst from the urn and formed into the specter of a massive, multi-winged insect. It loomed over the bassinet for a brief second before spiraling into the newborn in a hurricane of bright, golden-orange power. Then it was gone, and all that remained were the 7 elders and a wailing baby. It was the middle of the morning, the sun was high and bright, the sky was blue, and Fu was still unhappy. She'd been in Konoha for weeks, lured by Utakata's promise of being accepted by the Hidden Leaf and the people like them, but everyone that surrounded them seemed to have the same sort of prejudice that the citizens of the Hidden Waterfall had held, seeing her as a Jinchūriki rather than as an individual. Upset at the apparent deception, she'd been avoiding Utakata's repeated attempts to talk to her, a fairly simple feat for someone with her chakra-sensing capability, and remained in the village too. Well, she didn't really know. Going back to Taki didn't seem like a real choice, and really, deep inside, she kept hoping that maybe, just maybe, Utakata's words held the truth she wanted them to. After all, his chakra when she'd interrogated him hadn't reflected any deception, so at the very least, the Kirinine seemed to believe what he told her. But it was hard for her to believe him when all evidence pointed to the contrary. Of the other, Jinchūriki, the older redhead's chakra was a mass of boiling, simmering energy. Even with the distance she kept, the heat of his chakra was almost palpable to her senses, as if approaching him, being near his person, would burn her. If it was at all possible, the other Iwanine's chakra was even more volatile, a balloon one breath from bursting. Both felt like anger personified, and although one seemed distinctly more contained than the other, neither seemed likely candidates for friendship. There was a red-haired boy her age, but he felt desolate, a lone cactus amidst a sea of sand. Even without having seen him in the Hokage's office, Fu knew that this was the Sunanin she and Utakata had sought. Everything about him felt as inhospitable as the desert, vast and empty. She couldn't understand his presence, because where the 2 rock shinobi at least felt hot and full-bodied, alive, the sand shinobi was cold straight through to his core, if he even had one, hollow like a bird's bones, she thought. It was hard to even think of him as a person, and Fu felt guilty thinking it because she knew what it was like to be judged as something non-human. But then there was the last boy. Naruto. She'd studied him the most, his chakra a warm beacon on a cold night, a gentle breeze in the scorching heat of summer. It was fluid, mercurial, shifting with his moods, frustrated, cheery, confused, but there always remained an undercurrent of optimism. Joy. He was happy, genuinely so, nothing like the cheer Fu had to force herself to inject in her voice to feel like maybe today would be different from the last 13 years. She wanted to meet him, to befriend him, this boy who felt like every good thing in the world, and yet she couldn't, because he was always around someone else, someone who felt so different from him that Fu couldn't fathom how he could stand to be around them for more than a few minutes. And in the precious few instances he was alone, it was because Utakata was too busy looking for her to devote his time to Naruto, and their game of cat and mouse prevented any potential interaction. So she studied him from a distance, imagining what he was like in person and building him up to such a degree that she assumed he couldn't possibly be as great as she thought. The sound of the door opening and closing drew her attention to the path below, where a man with sandy blonde hair was leaving. Fu had noted his chakra a couple of times over the past month, in close proximity to the Sunanin for an hour at a time. She'd never considered him anything remarkable, another cog in the machine that ran the hidden leaf who apparently had some business with the young redhead. She watched him cross paths with a boy with dark hair held in a spiky, gravity-defying ponytail who was just entering the complex. They exchanged a few words, too far away for her to hear, not that she cared all that much, and then the older man gestured around the corner of the courtyard before they went their separate ways. Orange eyes followed the new boy as he walked around towards where Naruto was busy exchanging blows with the armored Iwa-nin. His chakra felt stagnant, like it was a great effort to utilize it, but there was nothing intrinsically negative about it that discouraged her in the same way the other Jinchūrikis did. Naruto has other friend Su. It was the first time she'd seen him interact with someone who wasn't another Jinchūriki or the white-haired man who'd been in the Hokage's office during their first meeting, and it gave her hope that there were others who were willing to be friends. Not that she was supposed to go anywhere, but maybe if they came to the compound. Awesome! Let's go! The cheer in Naruto's voice was infectious, and Fu felt a genuine smile cross her lips for the first time in a while as it floated up to her rooftop perch. She wondered what it was that had gotten him so. Naruto and the new boy left the complex at a brisk pace, their backs disappearing into the late morning sun. Fu felt her opportunity to corner the blonde without the presence of the other Jinchūriki slipping away. She hopped off the roof and followed their chakra signatures at a distance, keeping her own cloaked from any onlookers, Bijū, probably, prowling the area. Their team grew one by one, adding chakra signatures that felt comfortable, and wild, and rigid. They felt so different from Naruto, an amalgam of contradictory chakras, that she didn't understand how he could bear to be around them. Then again, since the blonde spent days on end surrounded by the likes of Jinchūriki who felt darker and angrier than any member of the quintet he was now a part of, it seemed likely there was something she didn't understand. This is my chance. Their signatures sped off to the north, and Fu continued to follow them at a distance over the Hidden Leaf's great gates and into the surrounding forest. It was easy to keep a couple miles between them and focus on tracking Naruto's bright chakra, an easy lighthouse among his 4 teammates. The distance from the village also made the cold, empty chakra following close behind her even more obvious. She stopped on a thick bough and called out, "Why were you following me?" He stopped on the same branch, as if she'd invited him there, and stared at her with the same emptiness in his pupilless teal eyes she could feel in his chakra. There was a healthy 10 feet of space between them, though in the middle of their isolation, it felt like hundreds. "I do not trust you. I don't trust you," Fu shot back. "You or the rest, Su. You're all the same. You just feel angry and sad and alone, and you're just okay with that when Utakata told me things would be different." It seemed like a strange place to vent the feelings she'd been keeping pent up for weeks, but the accusation that she was untrustworthy when the other Jinchūriki felt like great masses of negativity was a slight she apparently could not stand. "Sad," he repeated slowly, testing the word, "alone." He nodded, head moving up and down like a tilted metronome, keeping time with something only he could hear. "That makes sense. Why should it?" She was shouting now, tears brimming at the corners of her eyes. "We're people, too, Su. We deserve to be around others and be talked to and loved and not be alone." The Sunanin was silent in the face of her short tirade, and Fu used the back of her hand to wipe away her blurry vision. When she could see clearly again, the redhead was visibly trembling, hands clutching the sides of his head as if in pain. Mumbling fell from his lips, but it was too quiet for her to make out. His chakra was rolling with emotion, more than she'd ever felt from him, more than she would have thought him capable of, a mixture of self-loathing, fear, pain. Some trauma buried deep within. Fu hesitated before reaching out to him, guilt and concern in the gesture. "Hey, are you okay?" He didn't respond, and the Takinin stepped closer, carefully, watching for fluctuations in his chakra with her senses. When she was next to him, an arm's length apart, her outstretched hand fell on his shoulder, the comfort of human touch one she'd never received but always desired. Wild teal eyes snapped up to stare at her, shock clear despite the terror and madness. If she'd only been watching his face and not his chakra, she would have recoiled, but in the moment where he'd realized she was touching him, his chakra had flickered with a momentary serenity that she'd assumed he could never know. His shallow breaths slowly but steadily became long and deep, the insanity disappearing from his eyes until he was again calm. "Empty. You touched me. Yeah, you were kinda freaking out. You weren't afraid," he stated. "Others, nobody touches me. Only Naruto has." He frowned. "Why?" Fu cocked her head to the side, this curious, if still distant, version of the redhead was new. Everything was new, she supposed, since she'd been studiously avoiding him and the rest of their associates. "You looked like you needed it. You helped me." There was a tinge of some unknown emotion in his voice. Fu wasn't sure she would have noticed it if it wasn't for the fact that his normal timbre was so flat. "Why are you out here?" "I was following Naruto and his friends. I wanted to meet him, away from everyone else." "They're so." There was a sudden spike of chakra in the distance, a presence so foul that it pushed all other thoughts from her mind. Whatever grievances she had reading the chakra of the other demon containers, they didn't carry the weight of evil that this one did. And beneath it, a capsizing ship in a tumultuous storm, was the scared chakra signature of someone else. "I think one of Naruto's friends is in trouble," she said instead. The Sunanin's head tilted. "How can you tell?" "I can feel it." The boy blinked. "You can feel things?" He appeared contemplative, musing the apparently rhetorical question. Fu watched him, trying to understand what he was thinking. The emptiness of his chakra did not impress upon her that he was capable of such thought. Yet here he was, silent, calm, companionable. "Take me there." She blinked. Naruto's not there, why would you want to?" "Friends are important to Naruto. He cares." The boy frowned. "I do not fully understand, but Naruto says we are friends. And he promises to help his friends. He does not like to see them hurt." He turned to stare at the Takinin, expression unreadable. "I am indebted to him. So I will help his friends." "Okay," Fu agreed unsurely, drawing out the word. She gestured in the direction of the overwhelming chakra, and they took off at a clipped pace. Orange eyes flickered toward her companion at irregular intervals, analyzing him. He seemed different than she thought, given the feel of his chakra. Yes, his manner of speech was empty, stagnant with indifference at times, but he apparently could feel things, small moments of emotion spliced among the emptiness. And they were strong, too, loyalty, fear, even some semblance of morality. It didn't mesh with what her senses told her, which was how she'd seen, well, everything. Her worldview was based on judging people from a distance because there'd never really been anyone willing to get close. People were how they felt, their chakra, the one thing that defined their essence so clearly she could read it like a book. And now it felt like she had dyslexia, the world flipped on its axis, because this boy, at the very least, was different from what his chakra said. She'd always assumed that finding friends would be easy because it would show in their chakra. They would be bright and engaging and happy, like Naruto. But no one ever felt that way, or at least, they never felt that way when she was nearby. Am I wrong about him? About everyone? Fu was drawn from her musing by a massive surge of chakra, and then a brown-haired boy wearing a green, short-sleeved top and a white scarf appeared seemingly from nowhere, his form quickly growing until he dwarfed the Land of Fire's impressive treetops. She gaped in surprise, the boy's coarse voice shouting, "Cho Baika no Jutsu." They were so close to him and he was so large that it was clear as day when his small, dark eyes widened in shock, and a deeper, rough voice called out, "Shogekisho." Fu froze in her tracks, an even darker wave of chakra than the previous washing over her, its source far too close for comfort. Whatever technique the green-shirt boy was using ended, his form shrinking down to normal size and disappearing beyond their sight. Her companion seemed undeterred by the foul chakra, his pace unhindered by its presence, and Fu forced herself to follow him into an area completely void of foliage. At its center laid the brown-haired boy, and standing over him was the epitome of a demon, the clear source of the energy that was sending shivers down her spine, mottled umber skin pebbled with sporadic warts, long orange hair with a strong widow's peak, pinpricks of gold peering out of pitch-black scara. He raised an open palm and brought it down upon the supine boy. A block of sand a foot thick interposed itself between the two combatants, silica spraying outwards as the sheer force of the blow demolished it. All eyes turned to the Sunanin, whose hand was extended towards the fighting pair. "You will not harm him," the redhead intoned gravely. "More scum come to save you." The demonic-looking male turned his attention to the two Jinchūriki. "Maybe you'll be able to sate my hunger better than this useless fat ass." The sand shinobi's fingers twitched, and the surrounded silica condensed into a multitude of shuriken that converged on their enemy. Umber arms came up to shield their bearer's face, a gruff scoff escaping him. "Is that all?" "Pathetic." Orange eyes flitted over to catch her companion's small frown. Then the demonic male was rushing him, footsteps like thunder, and the gourd on the redhead's back disintegrated into individual particles. One open palm was thrust forward toward the smaller boy. Hasho! A compact shield of sand formed in front of the Sunanin's face, exploding in every direction as the crumbling palm blew through it. The boy staggered backwards, and Fu used their enemy's distraction to rush toward Naruto's fallen friend. He looked too stocky for her to pick up, so she knelt at his side and met his wide-eyed stare. "Who are you?" he croaked. "The name's Fu." The cheer in her introduction felt even more forced than usual, the clashing chakras behind her a palpable weight unbalancing her emotional equilibrium. She could see him tense, his left hand gripping a rectangular case with a red-colored sphere the size of a dango ball inside it, and realized that her answer gave very little context to someone who had just been on the verge of dying. "We're here to help." "Who?" "Can you move?" she interjected, pitch a little high. A quick glance in the direction of the fight showed the Sunanin stiffly defending against a series of heavy blows the umber-skinned male was raining down on him, and every step seemed to bring them closer to her. Not good. The feel of the demonic shinobi's chakra was overwhelming in its intensity, and Fu found that the closer they got, the harder it was to keep her wits about her. The boy beside her nodded, though he grimaced while leveraging himself into a sitting position. She grabbed his arm to help, urging, "Come on, come on, come on," when it felt like he wasn't moving nearly fast enough. She slung his arm over her shoulders and turned around just as the Sunanin slid to a halt in front of her, arms crossed in a block. Orange eyes locked onto the demonic form hulking before them, two white teeth bared in a smirk. "Well, that was more of a morsel than the fat ass, but now it's time to end this." He placed his hands on the ground and pulled up an oblong chunk of earth dozens of times longer than he was tall. "Doton, Dorio." One pale hand stretched outward. "Suna Hoko." A short, thin spear formed from sand buried itself in the demonic shinobi's throat, cutting off his ninjutsu in a spray of blood. The foul chakra immediately began to dissipate, umber skin fading to flesh tone, orange hair thinning to a short mohawk and small tufts above his ears. It was likely the lack of overwhelming chakra, but it suddenly seemed like things were normal, their enemy a boring, awkward-looking human rather than some sort of hellish creature. His form disappeared beneath the crushing mass of whatever earth release technique he'd started to use, clouds of dust billowing towards the three genin. The Kanonanin at her side let out a breathy "whoa," and Fu found herself nodding in agreement. The sand shinobi turned towards them. His teal eyes retained their hollow gaze, and blood speckled his face. He seemed unperturbed by the mess, though Fu thought it made him appear even more like the sociopathic serial killer his chakra suggested he was. She waited for him to say something, but he appeared frozen in the moment, unmoving, as if trying to come to terms with what had happened. When he finally moved, the motion was rigid, and it was simply to reach into his pocket and pull out a small gem, red as the blood on his face. It sat in the palm of his hand, and he stared at it for a long time, transfixed, as sand particles coalesced back into the shape of a gourd. When it had reformed, he blinked and met the gazes of the pair watching him. "Is there more?" Fu blinked back. "Ha!" The leaf genin at her side apparently understand what he was asking, for he said, "3 more. Otonin. They've got Sasuke. Uchiha Sasuke." Her companion sounded almost curious. He appeared pensive when the brown-haired boy nodded in confirmation. He is strong. Like Naruto. He turned to glance at the giant clod of earth that marked his opponent's grave. They all are, he muttered, and then, in a more decisive monotone, we must go. Fu nodded, slipping out from under the chubby boy and shooting him an apologetic glance when he stumbled. After a moment of focus, she found another set of chakras to the north, taking off after them with the second demon container on her tail, leaving Naruto's friend spluttering behind them. He seemed content to travel in silence, but Fu found herself more and more curious about the discrepancies between his chakra and his actions. You did good against that guy. Han's training has been effective. I did not expect, he trailed off, the thought lost to the wind whistling through their hair. Naruto told me there would be those who could help me become strong like him. I did not believe him, but I was wrong. It is not the first time. The sand shinobi's dry monotone was a suitable distraction from another spike of evil chakra in the approaching distance. It seemed a fair assumption at this point that the three enemies Naruto and his friends were chasing all had a supply of malevolent chakra they could access. What have you learned from Han? She asked, even as she picked up her pace. That was probably the name of the armored giant whose chakra felt like it was barely contained, always on the verge of exploding. She'd felt their signatures in close proximity to each other countless times over the past several weeks. Taijutsu, taijutsu. Fu repeated when her companion did not elaborate. But, that's like a cornerstone of being a shinobi Su. How'd you get here without knowing taijutsu? The idea that someone who just defended them against a physical behemoth had to learn taijutsu was baffling. Han says the same. It was not necessary before. Now, I accept whatever help I am given. Although, he mused, sounding strangely pensive, I am not proficient. But you held your own. Han says it is best to play to one's strength. The only strength I have ever known is my sand. So, she said, the single syllable drawn out with her musing, you learned to make weapons? Could you not do that before? It had not occurred to me. Crushing, squeezing the life from others, that validated my existence. Fu glanced backwards, studying him. The redhead's voice had broken out of its usual monotone and reflected a sort of nostalgia, his chakra flickering uncomfortably, desire echoing in the void. He opened his hand again, staring at the gem within, and after several seconds the feeling in his chakra disappeared. What is that? A garnet, came the flat response. Because of its coloring, it was named for the seeds of the pomegranate fruit. Shamans have historically used it to expunge toxins and purify the body, usually by increasing the ways chakra flows through the body. Some cultures believe that it is a natural remedy to heighten sensitivity, desire, and libido during sexual activity, and may deepen romantic connections. I see. She almost regretted asking, the conversation a little too awkward, but the silence felt even more uncomfortable, and so she continued, and does it, help you with that? I doubt any of that is true, the Sunanin refuted without affectation. It is a composite stone of alkaline earth and transition metals, silica, and oxygen, and has no mechanism of absorption into the human body with which to diffuse any sort of medicinal properties. People are fools. They believe in things which are demonstrably untrue. People want to hope. Fu offered unsurely. She knew she'd hoped, often foolishly, all too frequently. If you don't believe it, why do you know all that stuff? The library has a great many books. One indicated that garnets have been considered protective talismans against negative energy. He paused, the silence filled with his careful thought, understand, in some respects, how some might believe that. Rashi gave me this one to center myself, and if I focus on it, it is easier to think. When I told Anoichi that, he called it a talisman. It reminds me of my purpose, that I have value. Perhaps I am also a fool. Fu remained quiet at those admissions. Despite everything, she'd lived her life knowing what her purpose was. Takigakure's elders had made it abundantly clear that her one job was to protect the village. Memorize the chakras of its citizens, monitor for any potential intruders, anyone with poor intentions, and intercept them. They didn't care about commending her for what she did, that she was unappreciated despite the drudgery of her assignment, slandered with the title Jinchūriki. Her duty, designated by those in charge, came first. But to live each day having to reassure herself that her life meant something, even at her lowest, she'd never questioned why she was alive, merely why she was treated so poorly. She knew the effect, but not the cause, and the Sunanin seemed to know the cause, but not the effect. Except, she did know the cause, didn't she? Takigakure's elders had told her she contained the nanobi, even if they'd never explained what that meant. Utakata, for however upset she was with him now, had made it pretty clear that the people like them, Jinchūriki, were almost universally reviled across the lands, hated for something beyond their control. They kept the Bijū, entities of chakra given demonic form, at bay, and yet were treated like the embodiment of their prisoners. Knowing that probably explained a lot about why her red-haired companion was the way he was. Orange eyes hardened at the realization. If people wanted to treat her like a demon, then she would oblige and hide no longer. After all, there was no way the chakra the Otonin were using could make them more demonic than being the host of the Seven Tails. She wouldn't be afraid anymore. The second wave of foul chakra that erupted nearby nearly shattered her new resolve, but she dulled her heightened sensory perception and instead flipped through seals as a break in the trees became apparent, chanting an internal mantra that she was scarier than they were. The whistle of a projectile traveling at high speed was drowned out by her shouting, "Futon, de tapa." A great buffet of wind ripped through the surrounding trees in the direction she'd last sensed the evil chakra, leaves falling around the pair as they arrived in a small clearing littered with what appeared to be spiderwebs. Next to them was a boy with long dark hair that felt straight to mid-back, his beige short-sleeved shirt and fair skin riddled with dirt, blood, cuts. He adopted a defensive posture at their presence, white eyes not all that different from her own wincing with the motion. She could just barely see the outline of a pupil dart to her side, focusing on her companion. "Sabaka no Gara," he stated, timbre a stately baritone at odds with his current condition. "How unexpected." Fu shot the redhead, Gara, she told herself, committing his name to memory, a glance. "You know this guy?" Gara shook his head. "There are not many who capture my attention." The dark-haired boy snorted. "I feel I should be insulted, but I admit that I'm more curious why you're here." "So, 2 new players have joined the game, eh?" 3 pairs of eyes turned in the direction of the low, echoey rasp, and Fu's widened with horror at the sight before her, a male shinobi with brown skin darker than her own, his 6 arms sporting curved spikes and black wristbands. 2 more horns protruded from his forehead and further accented his inhuman features, including a 3rd eye in the center of his forehead, giving him the appearance of an oni. Gray hair fanned out from the back of his head, messy, bushy, and a golden bow longer than he was tall was slung over one shoulder. "No matter." The white-eyed boy charged at the Otonin with an open palm, but the demonic-looking male merely brought his bow around to slap the strike away. "Ha! Gotta level up more before you think to take me on. How about me then?" The Otonin's beady eyes shifted to Fu. A chill crept down her spine at the glance, and she fought the urge to look away. He spat out a series of small net-like projectiles that looked like they were made of the same webbing material that blanketed the ground, and Fu could sense the chakra of both boys beside her surge to retaliate. She quickly inhaled and then exhaled, chakra-enhanced air sending the incoming webbing back in the direction it came. Her opponent dodged, jumping backwards into the surrounding trees with a cackle. "Not bad. Let's see how you do in round 2. Fu tracked his movements with her senses, focusing on the fluctuations in his chakra rather than the inherently foul nature of it. The white-eyed boy pointed to her 8 o'clock and said, "Keys." "I know," she interrupted with a calmness that surprised her. She unleashed another blast of wind in the direction he'd pointed, and leaves rained down around them. She could feel his chakra ripple with a reflection of his annoyance at her interjection. As if to prove his worth, he added, "He has strong analytical abilities and likes to set traps that focus on overwhelming the opponent from all directions. He can also secrete a liquid metal from his pores which solidifies into a form of armor that can block chakra and resist physical attacks." "Then I guess we don't give him that opportunity," Fu replied. She leaped in the direction she could feel the enemy's chakra, twisting in midair and using the wind release, violent wind palm technique to repel the multitude of L-shaped golden projectiles that had been flung at her. When her rotational momentum ended, the green-haired girl expelled a strong, continuous stream of air from her mouth that blasted her even higher as a golden arrow whistled through the spot she'd just occupied. Another stream of wind pushed from her palms propelled her towards the oni-looking shinobi. Wind circled around her fist as she crashed through the branches with enough speed to see the Otonin's beady eyes widen in surprise. "Futon, Senpuken." Dark hands grabbed her elbows, stopping the whirlwind fist a foot away from its target. The multi-armed shinobi let out an amused laugh. A valiant effort by the new player, and yet completely futile. He opened his mouth wide, a spike of gold forming within his maw. One free arm reached up to grab it. And now it's game. Futon, Senpwashi. The Otonin's proclamation died with a rattling gasp as her foot met his stomach, the whirlwind foot sending blood and entrails rupturing out his back. Like the male Gaara had killed, the foul chakra and demonic appearance of the sound shinobi disappeared with his death, leaving only the dark hair and eyes of a six-armed teenager. His grasp on her relaxed as the corpse fell backwards off the tree bough, her feet finding purchasing on his chest as gravity brought them down. The body hit the ground with a boneless thud, Fu hopping off and landing daintily in front of the two boys. She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, a sudden calm pervading her body. "I did it. That was impressive," allowed the white-eyed boy, his tone even despite the acknowledgement. Fu nodded at him, a sudden shyness sticking her tongue to the roof of her mouth. It had been a long time since she'd gotten a compliment, even one as toneless as the boys, but she'd never before had a problem speaking her mind. Then again, maybe that was the old Fu, the Fu who had stayed in the hidden waterfall and made no friends despite every attempt to do so. But now she was Fu, the container of a Bijū, Jinchūriki, she admitted reluctantly, and that person was a stranger to her. An identity crisis, she realized, or perhaps more of an identity acceptance, a person she'd always been but hadn't wanted to be. Gaara's monotone broke through her reverie. "There are still more enemies, right?" It took only a moment to focus and locate the multiple chakra signatures heading north, and with a nod to the redhead, they took off again, leaving the white-eyed boy behind before he could offer any additional commentary. His chakra seemed to flicker uncertainly for a moment before departing to the south, back where they'd come from. Contemplative, she watched her companion as they traveled. Gaara seemed to have accepted who he was, what he was. His name even meant self-loving demon, which felt a little on the nose, so perhaps he had some insight. "Hey, Gaara, what, The question faltered in its escape, its very essence one of impropriety. What way was there to ask someone what it was like to be a demon? "You are quite strong," the Sunanin noted in the void she'd left. He seemed indifferent or oblivious to her internal struggle. "I think, after this, I would like to fight you." "You would?" The idea that someone, especially someone her age, would want to interact with her in any context was almost foreign. Her teacher's chakras had all felt reticent, reluctant to be near, though they'd done the duties assigned to them by Takigakure's elders without complaint, making her a capable tool to be used for the village's benefit. The lack of a proper team, of the ability to be a child at a time when all she'd wanted was an ounce of companionship, had birthed her goal to make friends. At least one. Though that had gone nowhere. It would please. And then he cut himself off with a rasping gurgle, one hand coming up to clutch the left side of his face. A hoarse no escaped him, and Fu watched, concern written on her face, as the redhead fought to get his ragged breathing under control. When it evened out once more, he muttered a tired apology to the Takinin. "There is still work to be done," he murmured. Fu swallowed, unnerved by how her companion's chakra had roiled with a tumult of negativity, but not scared like she would have expected. Perhaps she was growing used to the waffling emotions buried within the void of emptiness. What work? To be someone different. Better. It is difficult to change all I have known. What are you trying to change? She glanced back to find teal eyes that seemed to stare through her. Everything. When he seemed unwilling to elaborate, Fu allowed the thread to drop, disappointment flooding her veins. She was sure he had been a hair's breadth away from touching on the topic she couldn't bring up herself, but the distance in his gaze forestalled any questions she might have wanted to ask. "You are like me," he said suddenly, jolting the green-haired girl from her mood. "Like us." "A demon," he clarified, as if the point hadn't been clear. Fu swallowed thickly, mouth dry and voice gone at the abrupt continuation, unable to even answer before the redhead continued, "But, no, you do not bear the same hatred." "Hatred?" she echoed, pulling the snaggle of thread offered. She slowed down enough so that the redhead was only half a jump behind her. "Hatred is comforting, especially when you are alone. There is no purpose in solitude, except if you create one. With hatred, that purpose becomes a quest to seek out the strong and destroy them, because they are the only threat to your existence. Everything else is meaningless. The ideas you speak of, care, love," he spoke the last word so quietly Fu could barely hear it, his attention fixated again on the palm of his hand, on his talisman. They are foreign. Once, he continued, I thought I understood. I was told that, even though my mother died during my birth, she loved me. But there was no proof. It is, intangible, a measure of belief. My father, the Kazekage, as a child, he spoiled me to placate the demon, but what meager affection that offered turned to fear, and then to hate. Others' hate caused me pain, pain which could not be seen or healed, and which grew into my own hatred. Others were not meant to exist alongside me because I was not meant to exist, and so I sought to end them. The redhead's voice had slowly become more pitched throughout his diatribe, and he paused after the last word, seeming to have come to the crescendo of his own fervor. Fu could feel his chakra whirling rapidly, but with several deep breaths, he seemed to calm himself back down. Han and Rashi, they are strong and alone, like me, but, Inoichi says correlation is not always causation. I believe he means that being alone did not make them strong. Utakata and Naruto are also strong, and they fight on behalf of others, so there may be merit to that, but, he frowned, it is difficult to ascertain the truth. Don't you think we deserve love? Her voice was quiet with hesitation. After that revelation, she felt like she understood Gaara, at least a little, and her question was a dagger poised to slit their détente. He had never really answered her when she'd asked at the beginning of their journey, but maybe he would now. We have value, he said after several moments, I am told, so it could be that we are deserving of something. What that is, I do not know. I am not confident I can believe in something so nebulous. I've spent my whole life trying to find someone who'll see me for who I am, Fu shared, and nothing ever came of it. My mother, she swallowed around the sudden dryness in her mouth, the truth of her heritage and acrid taste, she gave me up when I was born. When I was 4, I found her. Her chakra felt like home. I went up to her and she pretended I didn't exist. Sue. Emotion was constricting her voice, but she held back any other signs of emotional distress. She'd shed enough tears over her life in the hidden waterfall. I didn't understand, so I just watched her after that. Sometimes she was alone, sometimes she was with my father. They seemed so happy, without me. And whenever they saw me, their chakra changed. Fear, anxiety, I was their daughter and they didn't want anything to do with me. Sue. So I was raised by shinobi who were indifferent to me at the best of times because the people who should have cared didn't. And it sucked. But the worst part was that no one cared about me, they only cared about what I could do. Utakata told me that there were people who would understand me, who would like me, but no one feels like they care. It's just like my parents. She glanced at the redhead. Aren't you tired of being treated like we don't mean anything? Teal eyes stared at her. Gaara's gaze was weighty, carrying an intensity that made her feel like he'd absorbed everything she'd said because she deserved his attention. Finally, he intoned, I am not sure I know how to be treated any differently. The fragility of the sand shinobi's admittance was broken by a sudden explosion up ahead. It sent their shared stories spinning into the surrounding trees like shards of glass, and Fu forced herself to concentrate on the multitude of nearby chakras. 2, no, 3, were falling away, like they'd been thrown in a deep hole, and 3 others, including Naruto, were directly ahead, with a 4th quickly closing in from the north. Keep going forward and you'll run into Naruto. Are you not coming? There was no change in his outward appearance or his chakra, but Fu almost thought he sounded concerned. She shook her head. Because her purpose had always been to know how people felt, she'd always assumed that someone's chakra was representative of who they were as a person. But the Sunanin was clearly more than he seemed, even if it was buried deep within, and she'd allowed her innate ability to poison her perspective. Now, after everything they'd shared, it seemed more and more obvious that she'd misjudged him, that they had more in common than she would have ever expected. There's another one. The goal is to save Naruto's friends, right Sue? I'll find you after. She stopped suddenly on a branch, ready to change directions, and Gaara stopped beside her, expression blank but clearly curious. Do you, after this is all over, do you want to be friends? Her voice was small, but she forced herself to keep it steady and maintain eye contact. You wish to be friends? The redhead's surprise was reflected in the widening of his eyes and the slight hitch in his raspy voice. In his shoes, she thought she probably would have felt the same. With me, we deserve someone who cares, Fu asserted, why not be each other's? Gaara nodded slowly, apparently finding the logic in her argument. I would like that. And when we return, you can meet Naruto. I think he will be happy to know you. Fu smiled brightly, an emotion she hadn't felt since leaving the hidden waterfall filling her up. Can't wait, Sue. Gaara gave her another nod and then jumped out of sight, heading in the direction she'd given him. The Takinin watched him disappear and then headed east, following the path of the fallen chakra signatures and leaping out over the ravine that had swallowed them whole. Chapter 15, The Fox's Mission. He made his way back to the village, body one big ache. Rashi never really bothered going easy, though he normally pulled his punches just enough so that Naruto wasn't seeing stars with every hit. Stupid old man, he groused internally. Utakata had let him leave early, his smile a little too understanding even as the blonde protested he could keep going. That had chafed, just a little, but with the way everything hurt, he understood, and even appreciated, the brunette's reasoning. Blue Eyes spied two boys and one girl his age being led back to the village proper by a dark-haired woman wearing an outfit of white wrappings that went down to mid-thigh. He raised an arm, resisted the urge to wince, and cheerily called out, "Hey, Kiba." The boy in front turned at the sound of his name, a small white dog perched on his head of brown hair. "Ha, if it ain't Naruto." He sauntered over, his two teammates following behind him. Naruto watched them approach, trying to remember their names. Kiba was one of the few people who had tolerated him at the academy, and they had often gotten in trouble together, but the indigo-haired girl in the cream-colored jacket and the black-haired boy in his own concealing gray jacket had typically been quiet and unobtrusive. "What are you doing out and about?" He opened his mouth to respond but then remembered his activities were supposed to be a secret. There was no telling what Rashi would do to him if he spilled the beans about their presence after only a week of meetings. Just trainin'. The future Hokage's gotta remain in tip-top shape." Kiba scoffed at the oft-repeated boast, and Naruto scowled at his dismissal. "You don't believe me? Let's go then, you and me. The guy who couldn't even pass the graduation exam." Kiba posed rhetorically, and his dog barked in agreement. Yeah right. Come on Hinata, Shino, let's go. Us real shinobi have real training to do." He turned his back to the blonde and began to stalk away. The other boy, Shino, adjusted his dark glasses before following his teammate. Hinata, pointer fingers poking each other, stammered a quiet, sorry, and Naruto-kun, before taking her leave as well, rejoining their teacher where she'd remained behind. A lead weight settled in the blonde's stomach as he watched his former classmates walk away. Whatever Rashi had done to him hurt far less than the pain of not being recognized by his peers, that he was somehow even more unworthy of their attention now that they'd graduated and left him behind. His fists clenched, fingernails digging into the soft skin of his palms. "I will be a real shinobi," he swore to himself, believe it. Naruto chased the pale, white-haired ninja carrying the cylindrical container big enough to hold Uchiha Sasuke, trying to stay focused on the task at hand and not let his thoughts wander to the fates of his teammates. Shikamaru had told them from the beginning that even though their goal was to rescue Sasuke, there weren't supposed to be any unnecessary sacrifices, yet it felt like every enemy so far had resulted in one. Naruto didn't know anything about the Niji guy that had joined them, though he seemed to carry the same quiet, arrogant swagger that Sasuke had back at the academy, but Choji was not someone the blonde would have picked to emerge victorious in a one-on-one fight, despite Shikamaru's endorsement. Niji's confidence at least made him seem skilled, more so than the rest of them anyway, but Naruto still didn't like that they'd essentially abandoned one of their comrades, including Kiba and Shikamaru now, at every fight. It felt a little too much like when Utakata and Rashi had left him behind and he'd gotten caught in the Ichibi's grasp, a situation that had quickly spiraled out of control. But he wasn't the leader and it wasn't his call to make. Shikamaru, the lazy bum, had somehow made Chunin, and apparently knew something about these individuals that he didn't. So despite his protests to the contrary, they were all split up, and the mission, his first mission, seemed like it might fail on both objectives. "I won't let that happen." He increased his pace to keep the Otonins back within view, urging himself forward with a mantra of positivity. The forest thinned ahead, and with an opening in the trees, Naruto finally found the opportunity to go on the offensive, flipping through hand seals and allowing chakra to build in his chest. Katan, Gokakyu no Jutsu. The great fireball burst from his lips and forced the sound shinobi to adjust his midair trajectory, shielding himself with the barrel he was carrying. Naruto's jump from the trees gave him the vantage point to see his opponent aim an arm at him, and only experience with sparring against Gaara had him pulling out a kunai to block the tiny projectiles sent his way. He hit the ground and glared at the older male. "Give Sasuke back." No, replied the Otonin. His voice was placid, unmoved by the blonde's grit. It reminded him a little of how Nietzsche spoke. He belongs to Orochimaru-sama. He belongs in Konoha, the Jinchūriki retorted, and it's my mission to bring him back. He took a brief survey of the area as Han had taught him, flat plain with short grass, no cover, no water for Suiton manipulation, and then concentrated chakra into the surrounding earth. Tsuchi Bunshin no Jutsu. 4 earth clones crawled out of the dirt to encage the white-haired male in a circle. His green eyes scanned the doppelgangers, expression inert. Very well. Rods of white material grew from his palms until they protruded at least a foot. For a long moment, the only movement was the rustle of grass as the wind whistled through it. Now that he was in a real combat situation, the lessons Han had imparted about not attacking a, theoretically, superior opponent with unknown skills had never seemed wiser. This wasn't a combatant training him to be better, this was someone who would kill him without hesitation, and he needed to fight appropriately. Then the Otonin moved, blazing towards the clone at his 2 o'clock with arm drawn back to bisect it horizontally. It tried to defend, but the apparent blade sliced through it with no resistance, and Naruto directed the remaining duplicates to converge on the sound shinobi's location with a thought, hoping to overwhelm him. Instead, the older boy spun on the spot and charged the one across from him, arms trailing behind him, just waiting to be brought to bear. The Otonin's target blocked the low to high slash by grabbing his left wrist, but he merely took the opportunity to stab the clone through the stomach with his other arm. A swift movement brought the weapon out the duplicate's side, and it lost cohesion, collapsing into dirt. Yanagi no Mai, he muttered, and white spikes erupted across his body to skewer the encroaching clones. They looked like bones? Naruto wondered. Was it possible this sound shinobi could somehow grow and manipulate his bones to use as weapons? It sounded insane, but he'd seen Rashi hold lava that could melt flesh, Utakata dissolve rocks and trees with bubbles, a reanimated corpse attack with all the skills of a live shinobi, so it didn't seem beyond the realm of possibility, though he had a hard time imagining it even with the evidence before him. You stand no chance against me, intoned the bone user. I have mastered the 5 dances of my Kekkei Genkai, and you have no discernible skills to counter them. Shut up. Naruto snapped. Who was this asshole to judge him? It reminded him of past interactions with Sasuke, Kiba, even Rashi. They saw only a fraction of what he could do and then dismissed him because he wasn't at their level. But he was better than that, and just like he'd shown Rashi, he'd proved to this bastard that Uzumaki Naruto was not to be underestimated. Chakra flaring with his anger, the blonde summoned a dozen earth clones to charge his opponent, joining a half-step behind to take advantage of the chaos. His dance of the willow still active, the Otonin countered the attacking duplicates with impressive grace, bones as sharp as blades slashing through dirt bodies with little resistance. The bone user's movements reminded Naruto of Utakata, effortless, sweeping gestures that gave the appearance of a sapling swaying in a breeze. The sound shinobi's garb only cemented the image, a loose, flowing robe that appeared far too big for its wearer. Naruto fixed the image of the Miss Jinchūriki over that of the white-haired male, blue eyes tracking his moves while he thought about ways Utakata had been successfully incapacitated in the past. Nothing immediately came to mind. The teenage Jinchūriki tended to remain relatively unflappable when Naruto was his opponent, though Rashi had done it easily enough in the past with persistent pressure, and the remaining clones dogpiled the sound shinobi in unison, hoping to overwhelm him with sheer numbers. The bones protruding through his skin grew even longer, ripping effortlessly through the duplicates, but instead of breaking into clumps of dirt, they slumped into mud, bogging the bone user in earth and sludge. Naruto rushed forward while his enemy was mired in muck and slammed an elbow into the older male's jaw. The Otonin didn't even flinch, and a spike burst through the muck to impale the blonde through the stomach. Naruto gaped in shock, then collapsed into mud himself. The ground at the sound shinobi's back broke as the Jinchūriki emerged from it. His knee hit the muddy mass from behind and sent the bone user face first into the grass. Flames engulfed the boy's hands as he brought them to either side of the downed shinobi's head. Katan, Injiki! Fire roared between his open palms, igniting the Otonin's head. Naruto kept the flame attack active until 2 feet wrapped around his chest and threw him clear of the muddy mass. He landed in time to watch the bone user rise, shaking mud from his form and straightening with a series of sickening cracks, bones snapping into place from however they'd been oriented. The white mask of a human skull, blackened and burnt, fell off his face. You have greater talent than I expected, he noted. Naruto might have considered it a compliment if someone he trusted had said it. As it was, it just sounded ominous. Though your efforts matter not. Orochimaru-sama's ambition is nigh. Naruto's question was interrupted by an explosion behind him. He whirled on the spot, a human-ish shadow becoming apparent in the smoke. As the haze thinned, the blonde could make out brownish-gray skin and a mane of spiky, purplish indigo hair, both of which receded to reveal pale flesh and bluish-black locks. It had been months, but Naruto still recognized the boy's profile, the red and white fan of the Uchiha clan emblazoned on a blue shirt. The boy's name was on the tip of his tongue, but a maniacal laugh, almost a cackle, split the air and shook his former classmate's shoulders. He paused, startled by the display of emotion. Even at the best of times, Sasuke had never been openly emotional, and up until this moment, Naruto wasn't sure he'd ever heard the dark-haired boy even chuckle. Then Sasuke jumped towards the nearby tree line, and Naruto saw his mission's success flash before his eyes. Oi, Sasuke, come back. Unlikely. Naruto spun around, cursing himself for losing track of his opponent, and prepared to minimize the incoming damage as much as possible. Konoha Senpu. A blur of emerald green flashed past the blonde and planted a foot into the Otonin's midriff that sent him flying backwards. The bone user regained his footing, staring at the newcomer with hard green eyes. And you are? I am Konoha's beautiful green beast, Lee Rock. Naruto stared at his savior with wide eyes, stunned by the last-minute rescue, and almost missed the other boy urge, you must continue your mission and rescue Sasuke-kun. I will remain here in your stead. Do not worry. He gave the blonde a thumbs up, head turning just slightly to flash a bright smile. Reinforcements are on the way. Okay, right. He rushed to follow Sasuke, yelling as he left, he uses bones as weapons and he's super strong. Be careful. Then his focus was on the path, and the mission, ahead. Fu managed to control her descent into the ravine with short bursts of wind chakra from her hands and feet, landing with a soft grunt on rocky terrain that lacked the impressive foliage that defined the land of fire. Upstream of the river that ran on her right side were several chakra signatures, one of them dwarfing the rest. There was another spike of chakra, foul, malicious, overwhelming, and then there were two powerful presences, nearly identical to each other, both exuding the same feeling that the previous two demonic entities had given off. She raced ahead despite the hesitancy that threatened to freeze her movements, finding a boy roughly her age wearing a gray, fur-lined jacket being assaulted by a two-headed, red-skinned creature, his appearance a reminder of the stories of Oni, an inhuman enemy. She steeled her resolve and rushed into battle, wind swirling around her hand as she sped forward, fingers clenched tightly for the wind release, whirlwind fist. A hand emerged from her target's back, grabbing just above her wrist and stopping her attack from connecting. What? She gasped, her surprise echoed by the leaf genin on the other side of the demonic shinobi. The head on the left twisted to face her. A third party, huh? It seems we're outnumbered now, brother. We'll just have to kill them quicker then, Sakan. Posed the head on the right. Get down! Yelled the Konohanin, and Fu found herself tackled and skidding across the ground. There was a high-pitched arf, and then a cry of disgust from the pair of demonic voices. Nice job, Akamaru. Let's go, Jinju Konbi Henge, Sotoro. The boy's weight disappeared, and Fu found herself in the shadow of a large canine-like creature with shaggy white fur and two heads. She gaped at the beast, its snarls drowning out the furious cursing of the sound shinobi. What? Garoga! The beast spun into a twister that careened at the demonic ninja, wind streaming past it and flecks of drool flying from its maw. It caught the Otonin within its vortex, bisecting his body and sending the halves careening to opposite sides of its flight. Fu frowned at the momentary lull as the beast stared down its handiwork from several hundred feet away. By all appearances, the Fong Wolf Fong had literally torn the enemy apart, but death would mean that the overwhelming chakra blanketing the area should have disappeared. Instead, it appeared to be surging, and in short order the two sound shinobi were on their feet, segmented black armor grown in place of each one's missing half. They looked hellish, Fu thought, with their sunburn-colored skin, single horn protruding from their foreheads, and spikes decorating their armored shoulders like pauldrons. Soldiers of the damned. I guess this is better odds, right, Yukon? Much better. Let's take care of this stupid mutt, Sakan. The white wolf, Fu supposed, was charging them again in its spiraling attack, and the pair of sound shinobi had their palms on the ground, planning a counter. Fu felt their chakra join together, and she raced forward to take advantage of their distraction just as they shouted, Kuchios, Rashomon. The Takinin didn't let the sight of the demonic gate, a technique that only reinforced her opinion of her lookalike enemies, rising from the earth deter her, though she did wince as the massive beast impacted it from the other side, creating a loud crump that petered out to a dull clang. She summoned wind to both fists as her distance to the shinobi on the right narrowed to only 10 feet. He twisted with a snarl that bared a jaw full of too many pointed teeth, a shark in the throes of a kill. Not quite. He shouted, voice high with sadistic glee. Terenkin. Within the span of a second, she took hard punches to the chest, stomach, chin, the last one sending stars exploding through her vision as his longer reach allowed him to continue raining down blows with the multiple connected fists technique. His maniacal laughter echoed in her ears with each hit, seeming to take great pleasure in her pain. One blow finally sent her flying out of his range. She crashed to the ground, gasping. There was a flurry of wind beside her, and then a rough hand was gently slapping her cheek. Hey, you okay? Fu groaned, orange eyes blinking open as her head lolled to the side. She met the fierce gaze of the Konohanin in the gray jacket, twin marks like enlarged fangs tattooed in blood red beneath vertically slit, animalistic, black eyes. Cradled against his chest was the prone form of a small white dog with brown ears. The canine looked like a smaller version of the two-headed beast that had whirled its way through the battlefield a minute before, though that might have been her vision still swimming from the blows. I don't know who you are, the boy continued, but my senses tell me you're better than those guys. Come on, we should take out the one while the other's distracted. Distracted Sue? Fu echoed, voice thick like syrup as she sat up. What an interesting plan, quipped a rough voice, but it won't work. Terenkyaku. Fu grunted as a foot slammed into her sternum, sending her skidding backwards in an uncontrolled roll. She barely registered the demonic shinobi thrashing her would-be ally, his body seemingly hunched to protect the small dog in his arms. The Otonin's familiar laughter rang out, and the kunoichi forced herself to her feet, shaking off the vertigo and approaching the one-sided beatdown while he was distracted with torturing the leaf shinobi. She threw a forward punch at him, hesitant to use wind chakra for fear of harming Naruto's friend, and found her fist engulfed in one blackened claw. His fanged mouth widened in a smirk. Pathetic. Teren, ag. The jacket-clad boy's sharp nails were stained red, his unusual eyes and enlarged canines prominently displayed in a snarl. That's for Akamaru, little shit. Sneered the Otonin, whirling on the spot with the green-haired girl's hand still clenched in his own. He flung her at the boy, and the pair fell to the ground in a mess of flailing limbs. You're all trash. Move! Fu hissed, scrabbling to her feet. We need to pincer him. Her ally was holding a hand to his ribs, one eye closed in a wince. Easier said than done. Boo, whispered the demonic shinobi, his presence suddenly mere inches away. Fu expelled a futon, repusho from her palms on sheer impulse, and his blackened fist broke the ground where she and the dog-like boy had just been, the violent wind palm sending them skidding, or tumbling in his case, over the rocky terrain in opposite directions. Terenkin! He shouted, but instead of fists, Fu found a barrage of rocks the size of oranges zooming at her. She held her hands out, one on top of the other with over a foot of distance between them, and summoned a horizontal whirlwind wide enough to intercept the incoming cavalcade, funneling the projectiles out its tail at her back. Vision obscured by rocks and wind, she felt more than saw the Konohanin's chakra approaching the Otonin, and only the shouted, Teren Senpo, alerted her to any counterattack. Multiple twisters erupted across the battlefield, and Fu felt her allies' chakra soaring in the opposite direction, caught up in the multiple connected whirlwinds. The roaring tornadoes overwhelmed her own winds, and Fu abandoned her defense in favor of propelling herself backwards with more wind manipulation. She could sense the Konohanin engaged in battle with the second source of foul chakra, whatever distraction he'd been preoccupied with having apparently run its course, while the enemy who'd been fighting them was rushing towards her, racing through the hurricane winds like they were some sort of demented obstacle course. Wind was already encircling her fists when the Otonin, Sakan, Yukon, she didn't know which one they'd been fighting, appeared with a punch and a sneer. She blocked with her wrist, the cutting power of the whirlwind fist slicing into the segmented armor of his arm, then swung her other fist at his two-pointed head and stumbled when the limb transited empty space, his body gone but dark presence still undeniably right there. Looking for me? She turned in the direction of the voice and found the red skin and pointed chin of an Oni inches from her own, his neck extending from her shoulder with lips spread wide in an ominous grin. Her shriek, echoing with shock and terror, was cut off when his hand sprouted from her ribs and clapped over her mouth. "That's enough of that," he noted, voice almost silky in its amusement. "In my stage 2 state, I can freely disassemble and reconstruct the cells and proteins that make up the body, and then invade your body and break it down on a molecular level. Basically." His voice faded to the background as Fu focused on his chakra. She could feel his tainted presence within herself, corrupting her from the inside, like all the darkness she'd imagined carrying the title of Jinchūriki brought had manifested and was poisoning her very being. It was invasive in a way she didn't think she could describe to someone who hadn't experienced it, a gross violation of her person. She needed him out, now. She turned her sensory abilities internal, seeking out the foreign cells like antibodies hunting a virus. The feel of her own chakra had always been a mystery, unable to detect her own essence like she could others. She'd always imagined it to be a little wild, energetic, a hummingbird flitting from flower to flower in a bid to find a place to belong. And now maybe she'd finally found it among a group of misanthropes, abandoned shinobi who felt like emptiness, anger, irritation, melancholy. Hope. So she found the foreign chakra, the blight corrupting her person, and kept focus on it while building her chakra within. Explosions split the quiet, but Fu ignored the noise and wash of heat, keeping all her attention on her internal task. The Otonin was still talking, musing about which organ to target first, when she finally released the pulse of chakra she'd built up. HGK. Blood splashed across her cheek and stained her white top a deep crimson as the slicing chakra of her wind affinity shredded the demonic shinobi's cells. He hacked up ruby-colored gouts of fluid, fanged teeth painted like a vampire fresh off a kill. "What?" he gurgled, the single word seeming to take all his energy. Fu didn't bother responding as his head seemed to slough off her body and revert to that of a teenaged boy with gray hair that fell in messy strands around his ears. Truthfully, she wasn't sure she could have summoned a response even if she wanted to. That burst of chakra had been an unrefined, unprecedented exercise of wind manipulation focused on cutting on a molecular level, and as sensitive as her abilities were, she'd known it was unlikely she'd manage it without some consequences. Even now, pins and needles were prickling her arms, her fingers, around her kidneys, down her thigh. Nerve damage, organ failure, paralysis. It was hard to tell what damage she'd inflicted on herself with that particular move. But the Otonin's chakra was gone, his body seemingly vanished with the shredding of his cells, his decapitated head the only memento of her nightmare. She breathed slowly, first through her nose, then in shallow inhales through clenched teeth. Unhurried, heavy footsteps made their way to her ears, and the waterfall shinobi tilted her head to find the jacketed Konohanin trudging towards her, blood trickling from his ears and fatigue cloaking him like a second skin. He ambled past her and knelt to pick up the small dog he'd hidden earlier, then turned and trudged back her way, collapsing into a tired sit mere feet from her position. A bark of laughter, almost a grunt, escaped his mouth. "Ha! We did it," Fu nodded, not trusting her voice. She couldn't tell if it was because she functionally couldn't, or because trusting the strange boy she'd just risked her life for seemed a bridge too far, even after spending so much time building stock with Gaara and having that pay off. Apparently unperturbed by her silence, he flashed his teeth and continued, "Thanks for your help. Akamaru and I are a good team, but I'm not sure we could have done it without ya." Name's Inuzuka Kiba. She stared at the hand he proffered, a foreign feeling dulling the aches of her fight. His grin was a little feral, but the wildness seemed more carefree than hostile, and his chakra felt, if not friendly, at least welcoming. Fu smiled back, small, hesitant, but no less honest, and stretched over to grab the offered appendage. "Fusu," she said, shyness coloring the simple introduction. Kiba withdrew his hand after several seconds and then stared up at the cliff face looming above them. "I've still got a mission, and my teammates are waiting for me. Are you gonna be okay on your own?" Her promise to Gaara echoed in her ears. "Yeah," she whispered, "but take me with you." Gaara followed the heading Fu had given him, and in short order, he could hear the sounds of battle, and then, high-pitched in the seconds of lull, a melody that had no place on the battlefield. He was used to screams and cries, pleas for death, for mercy, and that had always been symphonic to him, a dirge of the damned. This music, whatever it was, sent a shiver shrieking through his body, a simultaneous reminder of the person he was trying to leave behind, dissonant with a melody that made him want to plug his ears and silence the source of the torment. It must die. There were 3 giant creatures, he decided, wreaking havoc on the forest, moving around the foliage with wild swings of their humanoid limbs. They seemed to be fixated on a single target, chasing a form in a green flak jacket who mostly blended into the surroundings. Gaara ignored them in favor of targeting the source of the melody that threatened to rend his soul. Teal eyes were drawn to a vibrant spot of red among the browns and greens of the trees. Sand slithered from his gourd and shot across the space between them. It was hard to tell from the distance, but she, with the length of the hair, he assumed the figure was female, seemed so distracted by her playing that she wasn't paying attention to anything else. Even at the height of his dispassionate arrogance, with his shield of sand intercepting every attack, he never allowed himself to become blind to his surroundings. "Suna Hoko," he muttered, and the sand formed itself into a short spear that impaled the kunoichi's heart. She jerked once, her body toppling off the tree branch amidst glorious silence. The cadence that had built between his ears disappeared with the music, and the redhead felt something deep inside, something ruffled, uncomfortable, settle back into a steady calm. Better. A boy with dark hair held in a high ponytail shaped like the crown of some cacti landed on a nearby branch. His eyes were narrowed with wary scrutiny, fingers held close together in preparation for a jutsu. Sabaka no Gaara, he identified, tone cool, clipped. It reminded him of what Baki had sometimes sounded like when talking to him, as if he could control his fear by pretending ice ran through his veins. Gaara hadn't given his then-sensei much thought when he spoke like that, or ever, really, since the Jonin posed no real threat to his well-being. This boy was even less of one. "Why are you here?" "To protect Naruto's friends." The boy started at that, his hands falling to his side, one eyebrow rising skeptically. "The enemies you fight are strong. And Naruto, he would desire your safety. It is his goal," the redhead settled on. "You know Naruto." "That's unexpected," the leaf shinobi observed, posture suddenly lax. "Well, so long as you're not gonna try to kill me again, that's fine by me." Gaara cocked his head to the side. Again? There was nothing about this boy that even suggested he would have caught his attention previously. "You are, from the Chunin exams?" That other boy, the one Fu had helped save, had apparently known him as well, and the exams were the only event that would have allowed for that opportunity. The boy shrugged, non-committal, and muttered, "Guess I should consider myself lucky you don't remember me." "Nara Shikamaru," he introduced. He angled his head away, staring into the distance without giving Gaara a chance to respond, and then looked back at the redhead. "That would have been far more troublesome if you hadn't shown up, and I appreciate your help, but I have to leave. My teammates need me." "There is no need. They are safe." That finally seemed to elicit a reaction. "They're, what?" "All of them. The heavy one, the white-eyed one, and whoever Fu is helping," Gaara listed. "All of Naruto's friends are accounted for." He glanced around slowly, as if just now realizing they were alone. "Where is Naruto?" "They're all okay." Now Shikamaru reminded Gaara a little of Kankuro when the redhead's attention had shifted to someone more interesting. Relief, he thought. "I had to send Naruto on ahead. I guess that's where I need to go. I will come with." The Chunin turned towards him, one eyebrow arched. "Not to sound ungrateful, but I think you've done more than enough. You do not seem capable on your own." "I'll try not to take that personally," came the wry response, but then Shikamaru shrugged. "Whatever. Not like I have any jurisdiction over you. And I doubt I could stop you anyway. Given everything, your abilities will probably come in handy." He pointed to the northeast. Naruto took off in that direction. "Then we should go." He followed Shikamaru through the maze of trees, trailing the taller boy as he had Fu. Just like the green-haired girl had, Shikamaru kept turning to shoot him glances, each one displaying an emotion he could only guess were varying degrees of confusion or skepticism. After several minutes of watching the Konohanin watch him, he averted his gaze, finding the surrounding foliage a convenient distraction from the continued looks he couldn't interpret. Everything was so green, a vibrant, lively atmosphere that was a stark contrast to the neutral-colored walls of the Senju complex or the bland browns of the hidden sand. Every few seconds, his periphery caught another color, a bright spot in the deluge of browns and greens, and he found his attention riveted to it until his momentum carried him past. Life, the world, really, had never before interested him. It was all irrelevant to how he functioned. But now, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the small garnet Rashi had given him. Dappled sunlight filtered down through the canopy and cast the gem in a glistening scarlet light. The color was a stark reminder of freshly spilled blood, of how easy it was to drain life from his victims, because to be enemies would imply that he had a personal connection to them, a relationship he couldn't form, yet alone understand, to sustain the cries of mother. His head throbbed with the memory, hands coming up to clutch at his temples. Shikamaru's voice sounded distant despite being only one jump ahead, everything garbled by the relentless throbbing in his brain. He inhaled deeply in an attempt to steady himself, trying to force himself to hear Inoichi's calm words of acceptance from sessions past, and teal eyes flickered back and forth, finding only an endless cage of trees, the greenery unperturbed by his mental breakdown. Trees. He forced himself to focus on the forest around him, gaze simultaneously intense and vacant. His brain cycled through words he'd absorbed in weeks of sleepless nights, the Senja's library, a repository of information he'd never known existed. Plants, biology, ecology, the number of tomes on those subjects seemed disproportionately high compared to the rest, and he'd come to learn that life was vast. Where life before had been crimson blood, now it was everything. Gray squirrels, blue birds, orange cats, the green of the flora. It became easier to breathe, realizing that life was more than he defined it previously. The garnet suddenly felt like less of an anchor meant to bind him, to keep him in stasis, and more of the talisman Inoichi had deemed it, a guide to a better, even healthy, perspective. Life could be about more than death, about the scarlet stain of another person whose futile struggle had ended. It was everywhere, in everything, and he could find it if he focused on something other than the past. "Hey," Shikamaru called, his voice breaking through the redhead's epiphany, "are you okay? You seem a bit out of it, and I think we're gonna need all our wits about us." Teal eyes focused on the Konohanin with an unrelenting gaze, eyebrows furrowing slightly. It was getting a little annoying that people kept asking him that. Fine. Judging by the way the dark-haired boy was looking at him, he was being heavily scrutinized. But then his companion returned his gaze to the path ahead with nothing further said, and Gaara allowed his attention to drift in the same direction. The light ahead seemed to be getting brighter, the trees thinning, and then suddenly they were in the middle of a field where two combatants were facing off. Gaara immediately recognized the emerald-colored jumpsuit of the black-haired boy, and the surprise he remembered feeling at the leaf shinobi breaking through his shield of sand resurfaced as he watched the boy struggling in close combat against another male with gray-white hair and a too large off-white kimono. "Lee!" shouted another voice, and the Sunanin's gaze swiveled to where the long-haired, white-eyed boy Fu had rescued earlier was rushing forward, away from the seated form of the brown-haired, heavy-set boy Gaara himself had saved. He summoned sand from his gourd and directed it forward to intercept what looked to be a killing blow, but they were too close, he could already tell it wouldn't make it in time. There was a grunt from the boy beside him, and darkness wrapped its way up the Otonin's legs, waist, torso, arms, freezing the extended limb in place. "Kagekubishibari no Jutsu," mumbled Shikamaru. His voice sounded strained. "Though maybe not for long, this guy's strong. How unexpected." The deep voice of the white-haired male lacked effect, bored by the proceedings. "More of you keep showing up to interfere with Orochimaru-sama's plans." Dark markings, lines branching out into more lines like a genealogical map, spread across pale skin. Shikamaru groaned, and Gaara turned to him to find sweat beading the boy's brow. "He's too strong. Niji, get Lee and get back." The boy with long hair and white eyes grabbed the dark-haired boy, Lee, Gaara remembered, Shikamaru's call triggering a memory, and dragged him back to where the heavy-set boy was watching them all. Gaara's sand finally reached the Otonin, who distanced himself from the gathered boys, the darkness that had restrained him returning to Shikamaru and settling into his shadow. The Chunin fell to one knee with a heavy breath. "You are not particularly strong," Gaara noted. "The jutsu is limited by the strength of the target," Shikamaru panted, "and our physical distance. Those markings gave him enough chakra to overpower me easily. The girl I fought had something similar. I believe they have another form. The ones we fought did not appear human. Great. We need a plan. Now." Shikamaru got to his feet and staggered over to where Niji and Lee were arguing. Gaara made to follow him, but Teal Eyes caught movement heading for the group of Konohanin. They are not prepared, he realized. His entire purpose for embarking on this mission was at stake. His gourd dissolved into individual granules and reformed into a convex shield as he interposed himself in the path of the attacking sound shinobi. Chakra pushed the silica together, strengthening the shield enough to withstand the blow of the pale shinobi. Something white and sharpened to a needle's tip pierced the sand and buried itself in his ribcage. Gaara screamed, agony flaring white-hot as his defenses were again penetrated, a pain that was becoming familiar but no less shocking racking his body. For the second time in his life, blood trickled from his body rather than that of his enemies, and he found himself paralyzed, too focused on the pain leaking from his torso with every drop of scarlet. Sabaka no, you are moniker, justice, came the flat voice of the Otonin. His monotone was fading in and out of focus, a melody that kept skipping notes, the silences filled by a ringing in his ears that drowned out everything else. No, Matt. The sand he'd erected as a shield crumbled to reveal green eyes as ambivalent as his own. It was hard to tell through the haze of pain, he might have been imagining things, but the skin of the other male's shoulder appeared to open, and he reached over to pull another slender white weapon out of it. There was a shout, it sounded almost like his name, and the white object seemed to come closer. A burst of wind against his skin, and green as vibrant as the forest they'd traversed overtook his vision. Lee's leg was extended vertically, his kick having thrown off the Otonin's strike. A different body barreled into Gaara from the side, and the redhead found himself tumbling with no awareness of his surroundings. After several seconds, he found himself splayed out on the grass and looking at the sky, a clear, bright blue. Nice job, Choji, came Shikamaru's voice, and then his dark hair and eyes entered the redhead's vision. Gaara, are you okay? No, he wanted to say this time. He was on a mission that didn't fully make sense to him, he was in pain, again, and his blood, was flowing freely from his body. But while all of those things ran through his mind, he couldn't manage to utter the words. It was yet another reminder of how weak he was, sealed by Jiraiya to prevent him from losing control, his automatic defense locked away, his ability to manipulate sand neutered to the bare minimum, why Naruto insisted he could be strong when he seemed to be anything but made no sense. Although, he'd managed to beat that first Otonin, the one whose blows had rained down as strong as Han's, hadn't he? And the girl he'd saved Shikamaru from, killing her had been as easy as anything he'd accomplished back in his pre-Konoha days, hadn't it? They weren't weak, and he'd managed to best them in even his current state. Perhaps it wasn't him, but that this opponent was just that much stronger, and he'd only ever had one goal when it came to strong shinobi: kill them. Seeming to take his silence as answer enough, Shikamaru hurriedly explained, there isn't much time. I don't have anything for your wound, but, Choji, give me your scarf and one of those soldier pills. This might hurt, he warned. Gaara felt a sharp pinch around his torso, and an involuntary gasp escaped his lips. Careful hands adjusted his body to tightly cinch something around his ribs. Gaara, focus. I have, shit. Kage main no jutsu. Damn, this guy's ridiculous. Lee, move. Gaara blinked repeatedly in an attempt to follow the leaf shinobi's direction, and when his sight finally stopped blurring, he found himself staring once more at brilliant green. Between his realization and what he could only assume was a makeshift tourniquet around his wound, his faculties were starting to return. Apologies, Gaara-san. Lee's voice sounded a little harried, and the redhead was hoisted off the ground and into the other boy's arms. You seem different from our last meeting. I have been through much, he rasped, crawling out of Lee's arms in a moment of clarity and placing a hand to his head to forestall a wave of vertigo. Lee nodded. As have I. While I don't mean to cast aspersions, it has not been easy recovering from our fight. Gaara didn't respond, though it was hard to say if it was due to not knowing what to say or the fog that clouded his mind and body. Teal eyes glanced down at the white cloth wrapped around his torso, a rust-colored stain slowly spreading across its length. I'm still bleeding, he observed, and his internal voice held a calm in stark contrast to how he'd reacted to the wound. But he was still alive, he could feel it in the way his body throbbed with a pain he'd only experienced since coming to Konoha, and that meant something. Perhaps he did have a purpose, some value that had yet to be qualified, and that was why he was still here. Gaara, are you with us? Sand lashed out and caught a handful of small, white projectiles that had targeted their group. They burrowed their way through his defense, the silica absorbing the momentum, until they dropped out the other side. The redhead caught Shikamaru's surprised expression and offered him only a curt nod in response. Lee blazed forward as Shikamaru dropped to his knee and the brown-haired boy Gaara had rescued earlier. Choji, he guessed, since there was no one else around and he vaguely recalled Shikamaru saying it, took up vigil beside him. Darkness pooled at Shikamaru's feet as Lee engaged the Otonin with a flurry of kicks that were countered by his opponent's fluid movements and protrusions of hard, white material, bone, he guessed, that burst through his skin at random locations. Sand shot forward at his direction, small clumps that formed into shuriken and targeted any exposed areas he could see. The bone user appeared unaffected by the small cuts that peppered him, instead sprouting enough bones to give him the rough appearance of a porcupine and spinning into an elaborate move that threatened to slash Lee from every angle. With a thought, Gaara reshaped the shuriken into floating bracers that worked to intercept the attacks, reforming them whenever an attack managed to disperse the individual granules. The Otonin suddenly froze. The redhead heard Shikamaru groan beside him, then, Lee, now. And then Lee vanished, reappearing inside the bone user's guard with a shout of, "First gate, Kaimon, release." Omote Renge. The Otonin flew skyward from the power of Lee's kick, the green-clad boy appearing behind him in midair and wrapping him in bandages, attempting to avoid the protruding bones as much as possible. Gaara watched with ominous nostalgia as the Konohanin implemented the primary lotus, the same technique he'd used, unsuccessfully, against the redhead himself in the Chunin exams. Just as Lee drove his opponent headfirst into the ground, the Otonin's skin darkened to an ashy brown, and a thick tail sprouted from the base of his spine. The ground caved in at their impact, and Lee leaped away to land unsteadily a careful distance from their enemy. What rose from the crater appeared more animal than human, yet less demonic than the other sound shinobi they'd faced. Aside from the tail, large, curved bones longer and thicker than the boy's arm grew out from his back in all directions, thin petals of a hellish flower. He turned yellow eyes with pitch-black, almost soulless, stare to the assembled Konohanin. "Dealing with you has become tedious," he announced. Gaara knew that tone of voice. He'd used it often enough to know that the only thing left for the audience was an imminent death. A glance to the side told him that neither Shikamaru nor Choji seemed to have any strategies at hand, and Lee appeared to have spent his energy using the primary lotus. Sand rushed to each of the leaf shinobi as the bone user knelt down and uttered, "Sawarabi no mai." Bone spikes burst from the ground like bamboo shoots, and Gaara managed to create small platforms of sand to elevate himself and Naruto's friends above the field before they were skewered. His head swam with the exertion, the extensive sand manipulation a test of his reduced control and injured state. Movement caught his periphery, and the redhead barely managed to strip off the layer of sand that served as his second skin and turn the granules into palm-sized shields to stop a whip made of spiked bone and cartilage from binding him in place. It coiled around him, an inch from his skin and pressing against the resisting sand. "You are proving to be quite persistent," the Otonin stated. He was staring at the sand genin from amidst the field of bones, and Gaara only found the same determination Naruto often glared at him with reflected in the inhuman gaze. "That ends now." Bones grew from his forearm until his entire left arm was engulfed by a conical spear as long as his body. "Tasenka no mai, Hana. Now die." The bone user leaped for him, crashing through and destroying a swath of the bone field with the spear poised to run him through, and Gaara was sure that nothing Han had taught him would stop the Otonin, especially in his current state. Byuban Baika no Jutsu. A hand large enough to block out the sun swatted at the sound shinobi. Gaara looked over to find the extended limb belonged to Choji, who let out a short shriek as the bone spear pierced the soft flesh of his palm and sent blood spraying outward. His attack momentarily deterred, the Otonin landed on the ground, dark gaze flitting over to where Shikamaru and Choji were floating, the latter's arm returning to its normal size. "Nats," he growled, pointing the spear at the pair and manipulating the bones so that the weapon bloomed open like a flower. From his angle, Gaara could see a bone emerging from the white-haired male's palm, which was leveled in the direction of the two Konohanin in a parody of an arrow targeting a caged bird. "Tasenka no mai." A vortex of gray barreled into the bone user from his blind spot with a roar of "Tsuga." It rebounded off the Otonin and landed in the open area the bone user had originally started, revealing a boy with brown hair, a gray jacket, and a grin bearing sharp teeth. "Ha, gotcha!" The bone whip pressuring his sand went slack, and Gaara returned his attention to the sound shinobi to find him staggering backwards, a bone buried in his chest. The whip fell from the Otonin's grasp, and he collapsed on his back, the inhuman features of his transformation fading to reveal a pale, emaciated form, still in death. "Kiba!" Choji gasped. The danger taken care of, Gaara allowed the control over his sand to lapse, and the four floating shinobi descended to alight carefully in open spots on the ground. The redhead nearly collapsed on his feet, but a sudden presence at his side, an arm curving around his back, kept him upright. He tilted his head just enough to see that Fu was the one holding him up, apparently unconcerned with being near or touching him. "Just like Naruto. You are here," he said, tiredness masking his surprise. Fu's green hair shifted with her nod, a small grin quirking her lips. I said I would, right? And in better shape than you, Sue. Gaara nodded slowly, teal eyes sliding closed. Protecting Naruto's friends is not easy, but we did it. She sounded cheerful, and again, Gaara found the similarities between her and Naruto uncanny. You don't look so good. Blood, pain. His words were beginning to slur, an unfamiliar exhaustion consuming his body. We should go. Her voice changed, hushed, hurried, a reminder of when Naruto had hovered over him and asked if he was okay, and she shifted his body to a, presumably, more comfortable position. Come on, it's a long way back. Gaara only managed a grunt of acknowledgement before he felt them move. She faltered, shift his body again, hissed, in pain. He wondered, and then practically staggered onwards, burdened by his weight. By the time Shikamaru turned away from his team to speak to the two Jinchūriki, they were gone. He frowned, then returned his attention to the other Leaf Shinobi and said, the mission isn't done yet. Let's go. Naruto pushed himself to catch up to his former classmate, the last leg of a relay he'd been running a long time. Sasuke was quick, and like the Otonin before, had a small lead, but the blonde was motivated to muscle through any discomfort he may have felt to complete the mission objective. The longer they ran, the more it became apparent that the Uchiha was either a willing participant in his own kidnapping or that he'd been mind-controlled to ignore all suggestions to return to the hidden leaf. He'd had plenty of opportunity at this point to stop his flight and come back of his own volition, that he hadn't meant he was unlikely to respond to anything that wasn't force. In a way, working with the assumption Sasuke was incapable of returning by his own power made things easier. The blonde could put all his attention on strategizing offense and defense, as Han had taught him, rather than trying to convince the boy of something he was unwilling, or incapable, of hearing. He caught sight of his former classmate's blue shirt among the trees, urging himself forward to the distant sound of rushing water. It seemed to grow exponentially louder over the next several seconds, the noise increasing as his distance to the other boy narrowed. Sasuke leaped out of the trees and into the sunlight, Naruto 2 bounds behind with his hands flipping through seals. When he followed the dark-haired boy out of the forest, the source of the water revealed itself to be an impressive waterfall situated between 2 stone statues standing hundreds of feet tall, the crest of the falls at their shoulders. The Uchiha was standing on the nearer of the statues, and as the blonde watched him jump from its crown, he finished the last sign of a technique Utakata had helped him learn. Sway Tun, Taju Sway Ben. Half a dozen water whips erupted from the center of the river and surged up to ensnare the Uchiha. Sasuke caught sight of them mid-flight and twisted to avoid them, limbs splayed in positions Naruto wouldn't have assumed possible. When he landed on the water's surface, momentum lost, his head was craned upwards to fix the blonde, steady on the statue's head far above, with a glare. At least, that's what the Jinchūriki assumed. The runaway Leaf Shinobi was too far away to really tell, but Naruto knew what it was like to be stymied by someone, and in Sasuke's situation, he would probably be glaring, too. You can't stop me! Sasuke shouted, voice echoing between the stone sentinels, barely audible above the waterfall. Naruto grit his teeth, a familiar irritation coursing through him. He was tired of being told what he could and couldn't do. I can and I will, he yelled back, and whether the other boy could hear him didn't even matter, believe it. Suetun, Shigure. Small orbs of water rose around the Uchiha and converged upon his position. Sasuke ducked and weaved around the drizzle technique's projectiles with a fluidity greater than the bone users, better even than Utakata, appearing almost preternaturally gifted at evasion. He turned, unleashing a multitude of orange flames in the blonde's direction, and Naruto took several steps away from the statue's edge to avoid them. He watched them shoot past and then angle towards him from their zenith, and skipped backwards to avoid each one as it tried to ignite him. His foot found no further purchase, blue eyes widening as he stumbled backwards into freefall. He twisted in midair as he fell past the upper part of the waterfall, fingers twisting through hand signs as he passed by where Sasuke stood watching atop the river's surface, his mission objective falling out of reach. I won't fail. Suetun, Kyuzo Tsurushio no Jutsu. Apparently the roar of the waterfall was enough to drown out the rush of the surging tide technique, or he just wasn't paying attention, as Sasuke was caught unaware from behind and swept off his feet, carried over the waterfall's edge to succumb to gravity. Naruto then turned his attention to his own safety, adjusting his midair position so that his arms were tucked against his sides and his feet were angled to hit the water first. He entered with only a small splash for how far he'd fallen, spreading limbs wide and swimming to the surface to take in a gulp of air. A little chakra manipulation had him standing on the surface, water dripping from soaked orange clothing and blonde spikes in time to watch Sasuke crash into the waterfall's break with none of the elegance he'd shown in dodging the drizzle technique. The Uchiha crawled to his feet atop the water's surface and glared at the blonde with eyes like rubies. Naruto had only a moment to reflect that he had always thought the other boy's eyes were a dark color before his musing was cut short by his former classmate's laughter. Kukuku, you? I was expecting someone with actual talent to be chasing me, not some loser who couldn't even graduate the academy. The same anger from earlier reared its head. The Uchiha had dismissed him before without even knowing who he was. That was even more insulting than the fact that Sasuke thought he was the same person who'd failed his exams over 8 months ago. I've come a long way since then, Sasuke. His anger reminded him of what he'd gone through to get to this point, chakra building in his chest. Katan, Gokakyu no Jutsu. His cry was echoed by Sasuke, who sent an even larger great fireball to counter his. Dazzled by the ensuing explosion, he was caught off guard as the wayward Konohanin burst through the conflagration and punched him square in the jaw. Naruto skipped, artless and flailing, across the water, then backflipped to right himself. Sasuke shadowed his movements, then threw a roundhouse kick at the blonde's head that Naruto put up an arm to block. The Uchiha kicked the arm wide and then brought his other leg around in a will kick that connected with the Jinchūriki's temple. Naruto boggled at the maneuver even as his vision swam. That was a perfect block, taught by Rashi, perfected by Han. There was no way his opponent should have been able to anticipate and then counter it with how he'd attacked. Still processing how he'd been bested, Sasuke appeared inside his guard with a vertical kick to his stomach that slipped past another block and knocked the air from his lungs. He wheezed, taking a knee to his jaw that snapped his head back. It felt wrong to have gone through weeks of training with Han, months of beatings with Rashi, painful lessons all around, and still feel like he was coming up short in this fight. Sasuke's taijutsu was fast and targeted, every strike circumventing his defenses and precisely hitting its target. His movements felt sluggish by comparison, which was strange because neither Hidden Rock Jinchūriki were prone to taking it easy in practice, and there was no way Sasuke was better than either of them. Han's baritone echoed in his mind, "Turn the situation to your advantage." He allowed the next hit to land without any attempt at a block. It wasn't helping anyway, hands focused on forming seals. Kirigakure no Jutsu. Sasuke's kick sent him soaring through the mist that suddenly shrouded the area from the river beneath their feet, a swirl of vapors the only thing to mark his flight. He found purchase on the water and breathed in the cold air, the chill soothing his aching, winded lungs. "You think you can hide from me, Naruto?" Sasuke shouted. He sounded irritated, his heightened pitch familiar in every setback to master Katan, Doton, Yoton, the Rasengan, Taijutsu, every step of the blonde's training with the other Jinchūriki, that Naruto himself had experienced. Naruto didn't respond, too many fights with Han and Utakata having taught him that, even though the hiding in mist technique diminished sight, it didn't dampen sound. He focused on the direction the Uchiha's voice had emanated, again performing the signs for the multiple water whip technique in an effort to restrain the other boy. He snuck closer to his, hopefully restrained, opponent, pausing when an annoyed, Katan, Ryuka no Jutsu, echoed through the mist, followed by the hiss of evaporating water. "Where did you learn all these jutsu, loser? You're not even a real shinobi. I never stopped training." Naruto shot back, almost spitting anger. "And if I'm not a real shinobi, then you should be really embarrassed that I'm kicking your ass." Sasuke's fist emerged from the mist and slammed into his cheek, the dark-haired boy snarling, "I'm not losing to you." The Jinchūriki collapsed into a puddle of water, and Naruto waited until Sasuke's head swiveled to sweep his surroundings before surfacing from the water with a knee aimed at his adversary's back. Sasuke grunted as he was struck and driven into the river with a splash. He turned and tried to punch the blonde, but the move was sluggish, restricted by the water, and Naruto caught it easily before planting both feet into the dark-haired boy's stomach. Naruto saw him gasp, red eyes widening with surprise. The Uchiha's feet flailed, attempting to propel himself to the surface, but the blonde dove past his opponent and put him in a full Nelson. He was no mist shinobi, but Utakata had put him through enough training to hold his breath, swim faster, and move more fluidly underwater than the average shinobi, especially an untrained leaf genin. If he could hold Sasuke underwater long enough to fall unconscious, that would be it. The mission would succeed. They fell deeper into the river, and as the light above diminished, a powerful chakra began to swirl around Sasuke. Naruto had a moment for his brow to furrow in confusion before a pair of strange protrusions burst out of the Konohanin's shoulder blades and forced him to release his hold. The appendages, wings, he thought, absurd as it sounded, flapped once, twice, then propelled the Uchiha towards the light in a vortex of water. Naruto followed him with a few strong strokes, trying to come up with new strategies now that his opponent had leveled up. Transformed, he broke the river's surface as quietly as possible, head poking up like the tip of an iceberg, the hiding in mist technique keeping his presence concealed, and was greeted by Sasuke's maniacal laughter. "This power, you can't stop me." Then came the sound of 100 high-pitched chirps, one after another, an endless cacophony only temporarily drowned out by the Uchiha's shout of "Chidori!" Ah! Pain danced through his veins as whatever jutsu Sasuke was using electrocuted the river, his body still submerged beneath it. His muscles went lax, forcing him into a dead man's float with wide blue eyes and agape mouth staring into the sky. The mist thinned, his control slipping with the shock, and he could spy the Uchiha flying above him, hovering on wings shaped like hands or talons with flesh-like webbing connecting each digit. He looked as he had when he'd burst from the container during the blonde's fight with the bone user, brownish-gray skin, spiky purplish indigo hair, a black cross spread across nose and cheeks not unlike Rashi's Jinchūriki mark, and it only reinforced the image of a demon in human skin. Naruto twitched his fingers, attempting to regain some measure of motor control, fixated on his former classmate. A great fireball bore down on him, and the Jinchūriki pushed chakra into the river in a desperate bit of sloppy elemental manipulation, willing it to bend to his influence and creating a shield of water that bore the impact of the flames. The heat of the resulting vapor that blew over him was stifling, but when his teeth ground together, it was because Sasuke was turning his back and flying up and away. It was just like every fight they'd had at the academy, every person in his life who'd snubbed him for one reason or another, finding him beneath them, unworthy of his attention. Anger burned in him, the repeated fury of being ignored, especially in this moment, where the fate of his first mission rested in the balance, reaching a boiling point. He roared as strength flooded his body, the noise bestial, rolling onto all fours with working limbs and staring down to find a reflection of red-orange chakra bubbling across his skin in the shape of a fox. The vapor of the thinned hiding in mist technique and the crashing waterfall became humid, weighty with heat. Sasuke's chakra was like a beacon in his senses, dark, foul, terrible, and the nearby elements, water, steam, earth, seemed to feed his strength. Sitting on his haunches, he held his hands out, palms up, and balls of molten rock formed from his chakra with a thought, not a second spared on the frustrations of his lava release training to date. He hurled the balls, one after another, and they exploded against the cliff, barely missing Sasuke. Drops of lava cascaded like rain from the point of impact, burning ragged holes in the demonic boy's fleshy wings and unbalancing his flight. The Uchiha's ascension stuttered, and when he found purchase on the wall to keep from succumbing to gravity, Naruto leaped towards him with one superhuman bound, hand with claws instead of nails slamming into the back of the boy's head and driving him face first into the rock. Sasuke grunted at the impact, flexing his wings to throw the blonde off, but Naruto tightened his grip on the Uchiha's scalp and kicked off the rock, dragging them both back to the crashing water below. They hit with an impressive splash that forced the pair apart, both rocketing to the surface as soon as they got their bearings. Standing on top of the river, two demons fighting for dominance, Sasuke snarled, "Where'd you get this power, loser? Don't underestimate me, asshole," Naruto growled, the water boiling around him. The Kyuubi's chakra, he knew that was the source of the power flooding his veins, could tell by the easy access to lava release, by the way the chakra around him felt simultaneously part of him and dissociated from him, fell into the surrounding steam and fundamentally changed it, brown-gray skin sloughing off Sasuke's wings like chocolate melting in the sun. Purplish indigo hair swiveled to observe each appendage in turn, the boy apparently unaffected by any pain, if it hurt at all, red eyes turning to fix on the blonde. "What kind of jutsu is this? How did you come up with a jutsu the Sharingan can't copy?" Naruto didn't have an answer, he didn't know what the Sharingan was, and Sasuke's attitude didn't make him inclined to respond anyway, allowing the Kyuubi's chakra to bubble off his skin into red-tinged, translucent spheres in a parody of a technique he'd seen Utakata use dozens of times. A single roar sent them soaring towards the Uchiha, who called lightning to his palm, white-black bolts shooting off to pop each one. They exploded when burst, and the runaway leaf genin couldn't avoid the concussive force of the closest handful. "Naruto!" he bellowed, his rage momentarily raising his voice above the high-pitched trilling of the Chidori. "Enough of your tricks. Whatever you're doing won't stop me." He no longer needs to, you are within my field of divination. Hakurokujian Sho. Sasuke startled, whirling on the spot, but Hyuga Niji's fingers were already stabbing at him, faster and faster, the lightning in his palm dissipating into black-white sparks, his demonic appearance molting away to reveal the pale-skinned, dark-haired boy beneath. From his haunches, Naruto watched the older boy work, waiting to intervene at the first indication of necessity, until Sasuke slumped forward, inert, only held up by Niji's hand on the scruff of his shirt collar. The Hyuga's white eyes flickered to the blonde, holding his gaze despite the fearsome red-orange aura that swathed him, and Naruto thought that the older boy appeared, unkempt, fatigue softening his hard features. Naruto wondered what he'd been through, though relief at seeing him alive and well jolted him. Uzumaki, he intoned in his stoic baritone, then paused, blinked, and cleared his throat to start again. Naruto. Your chakra is overwhelming. Can you contain it? Naruto tried to tamp down on the power flowing through him, but it felt like trying to dam a river with a pebble. After several seconds, it became apparent that the Kyuubi was not going to relinquish the influence it was exerting. He shook his head, growling in a voice low with a bestial undertone, no. Niji watched him, and Naruto felt like he was staring at Utakata, the older boy mentally working through something that wouldn't be shared until he'd fully fleshed out the idea. I may be able to help, if you would allow me. The blonde nodded, and the Hyuga approached slowly, dragging Sasuke's prone body with him. Standing next to the Jinchūriki produced a wince from the stoic genin, and upon reaching a hand out towards the chakra-cloaked body, he withdrew it with a hiss. The properties of this chakra are corrosive, Niji observed. If you could reduce the harmful effects, even fractionally, that would help. That sounded manageable. He focused on the chakra's nature, twisting the corrosivity of it, in the steam, the bubbles, the lava, and trying to tame it. It resisted, and he engaged in a mental tug-of-war for control, finding a modicum of success. Try, now, he grunted. Niji's hand glowed blue with chakra, likely meant to protect himself, and he reached into the shroud again, 2 fingers gently poking at specific locations on his shoulder, his stomach, chest, thighs, forearms, until the chakra cloak dissipated and exhaustion settled into his bones. He heaved a sigh, sitting down on the water's surface and looking up at the older boy to express his relief. You're alive. I thought. It seems fate. He paused, swallowed whatever words he was going to say, and then continued, things did not go as I expected. Still, he glanced down at Sasuke, shirt still clutched in his other hand. Despite everything, we retrieved Uchiha Sasuke and suffered no casualties. Our mission parameters were completed successfully. Niji's last words rang in his ears. We did it, he whispered, overjoyed and tired and a million other emotions he couldn't put words to. They'd won, he'd won, despite all the naysayers. Mission accomplished. I told Rashi something was wrong. Neither Fu nor Gaara responded, the pair unconscious against a tree trunk, heads leaning against one another for support. Utakata hurried over to them, checking for pulses and breathing in relief when their heartbeats, faint, fluttering, but there nonetheless, became apparent. Dark scarlet liberally painted their skin and clothes, though he couldn't tell how much was theirs. I hope this isn't as bad as I think it is, he muttered, the tree's his only audience. He pulled out his bubble blower and exhaled a sphere large enough to carry the 2 younger Jinchūriki. It floated over, settled on top of them, and then lifted, and Utakata began the long trek back to Konoha with the renegade sand and waterfall shinobi in tow. Chapter 16, The Monkey's Mistrust. He'd been in self-imposed exile for 2 months when he finally made contact. His mindscape was surprisingly wet, water cascading upon the enormous form of a 4-tailed ape with fur as red as his own short, shaggy strands. Twin, black-tipped, beige tusks framed an open maw of pointed teeth, like the picture of a walrus he'd once seen in a book, and a crest of bone-like material sat upon the creature's brow, a beige tiara with upward-pointing horns colored similar to its tusks. Leathery skin the color of ripe honeydew covered its hands, feet, ears, chest, and face, contrasting its vibrant pelt. Its muscular body was restrained by large manacles of some silvery metal around its wrists, biceps, and waist, steel, he assumed, based on the seal Mu had described using to secure the demon, forcing it into a subservient kneel with arms splayed wide. So you're the Yanbi. I have a name. The ape bellowed in a deep voice that resonated throughout the mindscape. I am Son Goku, the handsome monkey king of Suirendo Cave. Do you think I care? Rashi cut in. Short arms were crossed over a small chest, an attempt to seem imposing when his 10-year-old stature was anything but. Pupilless orange eyes narrowed at the boy. No, why would you? The ape replied, baritone cynical yet measured. Humans are too stupid to fathom anything beyond their own needs, and all they need, or think they need, is power. My power. Rashi scowled, the expression ill-suited for his childish features. I'm not stupid. He shot back. But you're right about one thing, I'm here for your power. The ape shrieked, its simian cry almost deafening. I refuse. Someone so disrespectful is unworthy of my power. Fine. He spat, shouting to be heard over the ringing in his ears. The Yanbi was loud. Then I'll figure it out myself. His mindscape disappeared, and Rashi was left in the solitude of the cave he'd claimed as his temporary home. And without the Four-Tails' help, it was likely his shelter was going to be more permanent than he'd originally planned. Well, let's hear it. The mission was a success, Hokage-sama, Shikamaru reported. Naruto thought he sounded as bored as usual, though his normal slouch was absent, and his hands were laced in front of him rather than in his pockets. While there were some tribulations, he appeared to stumble briefly over the word, the fact that Choji, Kiba, Niji, and Lee had all been checked into the hospital upon returning to the Hidden Leaf a heavy burden. There were no Konoha casualties. Uchiha Sasuke has been detained by TNI to determine the cause of his defection. Tsunade steepled her hands and rested her chin on them, scrutinizing the two boys with half-lidded honey eyes. I see. Well, your performance exceeded my expectations, so at the very least, I believe commendations are in order. Her cheeks flexed, crinkling at the corners, the only visible sign of a smile with her mouth hidden behind her hands. Congratulations on a job well done. Naruto found himself beaming at the honest compliment, pride swelling in his chest. He'd known from Niji's words, but to hear the Hokage confirm the success of his mission felt better than he could have imagined. The Sanin's eyes flickered to focus specifically on the blonde. I believe you deserve a little more. Her hands unclasped, and she reached into her desk, pulling something out and placing it on the wooden surface. Naruto stared at the black insignia of the Hidden Leaf engraved on the metal of the Hide-8, words failing him. Congratulations, Genin Uzumaki Naruto. At that, he finally found his voice. Yeah! Woohoo, I did it! Tsunade flapped a hand at him, bemused and trying to hide it. Alright, that's enough of that. If you want to keep making noise, get out of here and do it at the house. I've got work to do. Like a cobra, Naruto's arm reached out and grabbed the forehead protector, afraid that if he left it unattended for too long, Tsunade would change her mind and take it back. For a moment, he handled the blue cloth and bright metal like fine glass, scared that one wrong move would break it. Hands shaking, he managed to bring the Hide-8 to his forehead and knot it at the back of his skull, looking up at the Sannin with an ear-to-ear grin. His vision blurred slightly. You're the best, Tsunade. Hokage-sama. He corrected at both her and Shikamaru's arched eyebrow. He turned on his heels and practically skipped out of the office, interchangeably humming nonsense and cheering jubilantly. When the door closed behind him, honey eyes narrowed and fixed upon Shikamaru once more. These tribulations you mentioned, elaborate. There were 4 Otonin accompanying Sasuke, the Nara began. Whenever we intercepted them, one would stay behind to stall us. From what my team said, each one was capable of utilizing some sort of extra chakra source that physically transformed them and significantly increased their power. Without intervention, he paused, dark eyes unable to meet her steady gaze at the admission, I'm not sure everyone on my team would have survived. One blonde eyebrow rose in question. Intervention. There was a third and fourth party who assisted in dispatching the Otonin, he elaborated, once again finding the authority of his rank and returning it to his laconic timbre. One was Sabaku no Gara, he's a genin from Suna who participated in the recent Chunin exams, and he was the linchpin of the Sunoto attack. When I knew him, he was, the Chunin frowned, well, psychotic would be polite. I wouldn't have expected him to ever come to the aid of another person, but he helped both Choji and myself and afterwards worked with our team to neutralize a 5th Otonin who was not part of the original team. He said he was there to protect Naruto's friends, but before this mission, I hadn't seen Naruto in months. You're saying his presence there doesn't make sense. Why would a Sunanin be this far into the land of fire, especially on his own, and how does he know Naruto, who wasn't even an official shinobi until 5 minutes ago? Tsunade hummed, and Shikamaru got the impression that she was only giving the appearance of thought. And this fourth party? Female, dark-skinned, short green hair, orange eyes. Niji said her height suggested an affiliation with Taki, and Kiba said she introduced herself as Fu. Another hum, and this time Shikamaru's dark eyes narrowed. Hokage-sama, do you know? Thank you, Nara, that'll be all. Her voice was curt, the dismissal obvious. I expect a detailed report as soon as you can get the full statements of your teammates. Might take a couple of days until they're out of the hospital and able to talk, but until then, enjoy the time off. Shikamaru bowed. Yes, Hokage-sama. Tsunade waited until the Chunin left her office before rising and following him out at a clipped gate. Oh, Hokage, great timing. We don't know how to listen and continue to cause me great inconvenience, Tsunade snapped, causing Utakata to visibly recoil. Yes, I'm well aware. Where are they? The Kirinin hurried to keep pace with the shorter woman, trying to get ahead and guide her even though she already seemed to know where she was going. You're talking about Gaara and Fu, right? Because they need your help. They're in this room. She opened the door he gestured to and offered him a sarcastic, great. Now get out. He jumped again, visible golden eye wide, and was about to protest when the Sannin shot him a venomous look. He hurried away at that, unwilling to test the blonde any further, and Tsunade shouted after him, and find me Jiraiya. Pains in my ass, she muttered, shutting the door behind her. Turning on her heels revealed the prone forms of the two young Jinchūriki Shikamaru had described, each laid out carefully on their own bed. Utakata, as polite as he was, had likely done that. They looked almost peaceful, prostrate on the clean linens, if not for the dried blood coating their skin and soaking their clothes. Grumbling to herself, the blonde approached Gaara's bedside first. The Sangenin's physical and mental conditions were intricately interwoven, and while Tsunade had faith that the seal Jiraiya had placed on the boy to restrict the Ichibi's influence would hold, years of gambling had taught her that even the shortest of odds could be beaten. Glowing green chakra encased her hands before she ran them in a diagnostic scan over the redhead. 3 broken ribs, perforated lung, chakra depletion. For a kid who's supposedly never been injured before, you sure get hurt a lot. She forced her chakra to speed the growth of cells in his lungs, simultaneously disintegrating the tiny bone fragments there and repairing the perforated tissue. The scab covering the entry point fell away as fresh skin knitted the wound closed. His chest expanded, filling with air that could remain where it was intended, and a flicker of her honey eyes revealed a hint of color returning to his pale face. Her focus turned to his ribs, chakra directing the broken fragments back into place. She forced the pieces to adhere to his ribcage, pushing them through the weeks-long healing process in a matter of minutes, and then burned the growing infection from his body. Satisfied with her work on the redhead, Tsunade moved to the green-haired girl's bed, staring down at her with an expression that warred between irritation and sympathy. The girl had proven to be notoriously difficult to keep track of, the only one of the 6 Jinchūriki under her roof to not subject herself to the conditional examinations and constantly remaining out of sight. She never seemed to go anywhere, just away, but her flightiness was annoying. Tsunade remembered being young, but her early teenage years had been in the middle of the Second Shinobi World War, when there was no time for whimsy or disobeying orders, Jiraiya's predilections, notwithstanding, so the Waterfall Jinchūriki's attitude made her a bit of a nuisance. Since there hadn't been any harms so far, and the Sannin had higher priorities with returning the village to its pre-invasion glory, she hadn't pressed, but now seemed like an opportune moment to finally dig into the mystery. Caramel-colored skin was speckled with dark bruises, arms, legs, and midriff all laid bare by the sleeveless crop top and thigh-length apron skirt, both white but for the blood liberally staining portions a deep crimson. A superficial scan revealed no open or clotted wounds, so it was likely the blood came from whoever she'd fought, or even Gaara, the blonde mused, sparing the prone boy a quick glance. Tsunade's brow furrowed as her examination deepened. The Takinin's internal organs were, she'd never seen anything like it before. There were pockets of cells throughout her body that were completely shredded, random sections of spleen, kidney, liver, and lungs blended to a fine powder. Even some of the nerves scattered throughout her limbs had been severed, though she couldn't tell how, or if it had affected the girl's bodily functions. She pushed chakra into the dead spots, unsure what would happen. After a moment, the cells began to slowly split, multiplying to replace the shredded ones. Her body eventually took to the forced mitosis like any other patient the Sannin had treated, and in short order, the Takinin's body was mending itself with just minor guidance from the blonde's chakra. Aside from the strange internal damage, and the external bruising, she seemed normal, which was, in of itself, unusual. While the group of Jinchūriki had shown no health abnormalities, the rest had a distinct, physical and human trait, not to mention the years of neglect and other psychological abuse they'd all endured. This girl, Tsunade, couldn't yet judge her mental state, but by all accounts, she appeared as human as the Sannin herself, albeit not blessed with the pubescent growth the blonde had experienced in her youth. Tsunade left the room to allow the pair in heal in solitude, crossing Jiraya's path and interrupting her former teammate's impending question with a clipped, "Watch them. Come find me when they wake up." Fu groaned into consciousness, stiff but feeling marginally better than whenever she'd last been awake. Her body was still recovering from her fight with Yukon or Sakan, whoever she'd killed, but the pins and needles feeling that had numbed her limbs and made carrying Gaara a heavy task only tickled now. Orange eyes opened slowly, the Takinin slowly attempting to leverage herself to a sitting position. "She is awake." Fu gave up moving to turn her head towards Gaara's dry monotone. The redhead was sitting on a bed maybe 10 feet from where she lay, his flat, teal gaze unrelenting. Beside him stood the large white-haired man from their group's first encounter with the Hokage in her office. His name escaped her, even as he opened his mouth and wryly offered, "Yes, I can see that." He walked towards the door, opened it, and said to someone outside her field of vision, "Can you grab Tsunade?" "Thanks." He returned to the room and stood at the foot of her bed. "Well, little miss, I hear you had quite the adventure." Orange eyes flickered to Gaara, as if seeking approval, but the Sunanin seemed to miss her silent question, expression unchanged. She couldn't interpret his stony silence, but deciding that he would hopefully say something if she was in trouble, the green-haired girl quietly offered, "I wanted to meet Naruto. Gaara said we should help his friends. Did he now?" The older man sounded bemused, and he tossed the redhead a quirk of his lips. Gaara caught and held the glance, but didn't seem to share the other male's amusement, his face betraying no emotion. "Regardless, I'm not here to grill you. Just want to make sure everything is in working order." That raised several more questions, but Fu decided to ask the most prescient one on her mind. "How long was I asleep? Rough estimate?" 30 hours. This one woke up yesterday. He jerked his thumb at Gaara, but refused to leave. Not that he had clearance from Tsunade anyway. "I do not sleep," the Sunanin intoned flatly, almost sounding annoyed, "and so did not wake up. And I was waiting to introduce her to Naruto. That is what friends do." The white-haired man continued to grin, as if amused by a secret he was unwilling to share. "I see. All right, Jiraiya, that's enough. Let's get down to brass tacks." Fu looked away from the two males and focused on the blonde woman across from her, her robust frame imposing in the doorframe. It had been a while since their last interaction, but her curt manner of speech was a stark reminder that she was far less free-spirited than her companion, authority cloaking her better than her green Haori. In case you forgot," she continued in a clipped voice, "I had rules regarding your, let's say, continued presence in my village. Putting aside the fact that you have been singularly evasive in submitting to a medical examination, I had also requested that you keep a low profile by staying within these four walls, something which the two of you saw fit to ignore. Your requirement was actually to stay away from the main portions of the village," Gaara corrected. Tsunade glared at him, and Jiraiya stifled a cough into his hand. Fu allowed herself a small grin at the redhead's capacity for bland observations, his direct manner slowly becoming a familiar comfort. He seemed unaffected by the Hokage's silent fuming, continuing in a monotone, "We ventured outside the village proper, and thus did not violate your stipulations." Semantics aside, she grit out, the spirit of the rule was clear. She cleared her throat, features relaxing into a neutral expression. "However, preliminary reporting from my rescue squad indicates that you both played integral roles in saving the lives of my shinobi and successfully completing their mission, so for that, you have my gratitude." Gaara's expression remained unchanged, but Fu offered the older woman a hesitant smile that, for an instant, she thought the blonde returned. Then the ambivalent facade was back in place, and Tsunade continued, "Going forward, I'll stress the importance of being discreet, wherever you are and whatever your intentions." "Yes, Hokage-sama," Fu murmured. The Sannin shot a hard look at Gaara, who merely returned the gesture with his patented blankness. They engaged in a momentary stare-off, which the Sunanin seemed unaware he was participating in, and then Tsunade broke eye contact with a grunt. Now that that's out of the way, the blonde announced, turning back to the waterfall kunoichi, let's discuss the remaining issues. I performed a medical scan while you were unconscious, and, aside from the injuries you received on your self-ascribed mission, I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary physiologically, although this assumes that whatever you did to your cells was self-inflicted by some jutsu. What did I do, Sue? Honey eyes narrowed. Sporadic areas of cells and nerves throughout your body were, for lack of a better word, eviscerated. I honestly wasn't sure whether you could be healed, but I guess your body is used to whatever you did, because with only the slightest prompting, your cells began to regenerate. I've assumed that your body is either acclimated to whatever jutsu you used or it's part of your Jinchūriki power. Her tone carried the same threatening edge that was becoming a familiar facet of her authoritative village leader role, and Fu found herself admitting, haven't used that jutsu before. I don't know if I'd even call it a jutsu, Sue. He was in me, she cried, barreling through Tsunade's alarmed expression. I had to do something. You don't know what it felt like. You don't have to defend what you did. Tsunade placed a hand as gentle as her tone on the younger girl's shoulder and was relieved when she didn't recoil. It likely meant there was some other context to her words than what they implied. For now, let's assume that you made the decision appropriate for the situation. There was a moment of silence while the green-haired girl was allowed to compose herself, and, not for the first time, the blonde wondered at what quality of life she'd lived, that all the Jinchūriki had lived. Temporarily pushing that feeling to the side, she continued, if you'll allow it, I'd like Jiraiya to perform an examination of your seal. Given your recent experience, I would understand if you'd prefer to post. No, I'm okay. Jiraiya stepped forward then, lacing his fingers together and stretching them out until they gave a loud crack. Don't worry, little miss, this should be simple and painless. Kid, he said with a sideways look at Gaara, if there's nothing else, I think it's time you head out. I would like to stay. I want him to stay. Fu asserted at the same time. Their simultaneous calls, one emotionless and dry, the other pitched and slightly desperate, echoed in the small room. The two Sannin exchanged glances, and the Takinin, abashed, added, please. You said you would teach me Fuinjutsu, Gaara intoned. This seems an ample introductory lesson. Fuinjutsu lessons, Jiraiya? Tsunade growled, honey eyes narrowing. What can I say, Heim? The kid asked. Just, she sighed, seemingly defeated despite her irritation, get on with it. Well, guess we gotta start you somewhere, huh kid? Come here. Fu watched the white-haired man and her fellow Jinchūriki approach her bedside. Jiraiya offered what was supposed to be a reassuring smile, though she somehow felt more reassured by Gaara's stoicism. They were friends, and that gave her confidence. Alright, just relax. She slumped to a supine position, orange eyes tracking the older man's movements around her bed. Gaara remained stationary on her left side, though his teal eyes followed the Sannin even closer than she did. With a single finger, Jiraiya touched her abdomen, and Fu felt a sudden warmth emanating from her belly. He let out a low whistle, and even Gaara made a non-committal noise that the Takinin thought sounded impressed. What? Is it bad? What's it look like? It's hard to describe, Jiraiya began. Like this, Gaara stated, and sand slithered into the air in a complex pattern of swirls and squiggles. Fu couldn't stop the gasp that escaped her lips, trying to decipher the mess of silica symbols drawn in midair. She didn't recognize any of characters, arranged in two concentric starburst patterns with a single line swirling counterclockwise from the very center until it filled the circular edge of the inner starburst. Well, that's useful, Jiraiya muttered. He hummed to himself, poking at the grains of sand. See this, kid? He gestured to the inner starburst with one large finger, tracing its shape. This is a Shisho Fuin. It's the backbone of the Uzumaki clan's Fuinjutsu, and... Uzumaki? Gaara interrupted. Like Naruto, one and the same. In fact, the design itself is almost a dead ringer for Naruto's seal, but, how? The knowledge of this sealing methodology should be extinct. Naruto only has it because of Kushina and Minato. Surely Taki doesn't have access to that kind of expertise. I don't know. That wasn't directed at you, little miss. Jiraiya offered her a broad smile that, even to Fu's untrained eyes, looked a touch brittle. He grew thoughtful, stroking his chin with one hand and mumbling to himself, and when he finally looked up to find Tsunade's gaze, his expression was carefully controlled, nothing like the jocular, easygoing man from earlier. Tsunade, if you ask me, there's no danger posed by her seal. Honestly, I think her seal is the most stable of all of them. One blonde eyebrow rose. Really? See this? He pointed to the outer starburst pattern, following its design with his finger. This is an extra layer added to what Naruto currently has, which is already stable. Not from what I hear. Oh? I'd like to hear more about that later. Regardless, think of each seal as a door with a different lock. Naruto's seal basically has one lock, but this seal has two. There's also an additional component. This time, he pointed to the swirls spiraling out from the center of the design. See this? On Naruto's seal, it goes the other way, clockwise. It's designed in such a way to allow him to grow with the Kyuubi's chakra mixing with his own. Here, it's the exact opposite. Everything is made in such a way so that the Bijū sealed within remains far, far away from the young lady here. For all intents and purposes, she's as human as you or I. Jiraiya continued talking, but his words sounded muffled, distant, lost behind his last declaration. Human. I'm human Sue. It didn't make sense. If she was human, why was it that no one in the hidden waterfall had treated her as such? She'd been a blight on the citizens of her former home, exiled to watch over but not be a part of it, cursed by the elders to bear a burden no one wanted to explain. It felt especially ironic considering her recent decision to embrace her Jinchūriki title, an appeal to the short list of people who could understand what it was like to be reviled for something beyond their control. And now, to be told that the one trait that identified those she wanted to associate with was no more than a title allowing her to masquerade as one of them was like regressing to before her epiphany. No matter what she tried, or how she appeared, she wasn't human, and it seemed like she couldn't even claim to be a demon in the same way as her fellows. So where did that leave her? Gaara's pale face entered her field of vision, peering at her with expressionless teal eyes. You are as you are, he intoned, and though his timbre lacked effect, Fu thought his intention was to be reassuring. To change takes time, and desire. Fu sniffed to forestall the tears that threatened to leak from her eyes. For as cold and empty as his chakra felt, Gaara was proving to be a faithful friend. I'd like to do some more comparisons of her seal and Naruto's, Jiraiya was saying. He seemed to be wrapping up his conversation with Tsunade. There's a lot we can learn from studying two different Uzumaki-style seals that have two completely different purposes. But that can come later. In the interim, I don't think there's anything wrong with releasing her to mingle with the other guests. Tsunade hummed in thought and nodded her head. Very well. That's all for now, Jiraiya. Take Gaara with you. I don't want him in my way. Fu watched Jiraiya move towards the door, but Gaara's teal eyes remained fixed on her. The older man turned back towards him and, when it became apparent the redhead wasn't going to move, placed a hand on his shoulder. Gaara's gaze swung with startling alacrity to the sand, the sand hanging in the air swirling around him like a cloud of wasps. She called his name, and the Sunanin turned back to her, expression intense. Go. It's okay. There was a long moment where the two Jinchūriki stared at each other, and from her periphery, Fu could see Jiraiya's muddy eyes flickering between them. Then the surrounding sand stopped twitching and settled into the gourd on the redhead's back. Gaara broke eye contact and walked to the exit in silence. Jiraiya followed him with a shrug and a careless farewell wave. When just Tsunade and Fu remained, the blonde took a seat in the chair beside her bed and laced her fingers together in her lap. Now that it's quiet, let's talk. The Sanin's voice was low, but Fu got the distinct impression that it was a command, not a request. I'd like to hear about what happened on your mission. Leave nothing out. And so Fu opened her mouth and began to talk. Rashi watched from afar as Naruto conversed with a brown-haired boy his age and height wearing a gray jacket trimmed with dark fur on the sleeve cuffs and around the hood. It was the third visitor the blonde had received in as many days, and the Iwa Nin had watched them all arrive, speak with the younger Jinchūriki, and then depart with a friendly wave, one after another. With each one, Naruto seemed to grow increasingly chipper, and Rashi found his scowl deepening proportionally to the Leaf native's good mood. It wasn't natural for a Jinchūriki to be so happy, at least before, when it had just been him and Utakata training the boy. Naruto's strange positivity had been punctuated by periods of annoyance, pride, anger, calm, emotions other than this persistent and unyielding joy. If he was trying to make up for the rest of the Jinchūriki being so dour, he was doing his damnedest, though knowing how stupid the blonde was, it was more likely just a function of who he was. It was little wonder Rashi preferred the company of Han, whose anger was justified, or even Utakata, who was, at worst, more naively optimistic than happy. The brown-haired boy fist-bumped Naruto and then left the complex. Gaara approached from the shadows of the compound and seemed to take over where the blonde's conversation had left off. It wasn't the first time Rashi had seen the two interact in this way, Naruto yammering excitedly while the Sunanin mostly listened, but watching his fellow redhead choose to engage in basic human interaction with what, arguably limited, information he had on the current and prior one-tailed Jinchūriki just seemed strange. He was changing, that much was obvious, and even knowing that Rashi himself had changed since meeting the other Jinchūriki didn't stop him from being curious as to how this boy, more broken than him, was making such great strides in self-improvement. So he walked forward to interpose himself in their conversation, lifting a hand in response when Naruto cheerily shouted, "Hey Rashi-aji." He exchanged a nod with Gaara when the younger redhead bobbed his head once in greeting. "You're popular lately, ain't ya? Ha, when you're as great as I am, everyone wants to know you." Rashi arched an eyebrow, and Naruto had enough self-awareness to look embarrassed. He'd never impressed the redhead with his boasting before, and force of habit wasn't going to elicit any different reaction. "Kiba and I were just on a mission together. He was just a skin about how I got Sasuke back. And what did ya tell him? That I've been trainin' my ass off since graduation and I'm way better than that stuck-up bastard now." Rashi rolled his eyes, though his lips quirked with mild amusement. "Meb someone'll finally believe ya." "He did not do it alone," Gaara stated. "We provided assistance." Rashi released a long-suffering sigh. "So that's why Tsunade's been pissed something fierce, eh? And who's we?" "Myself and Fu." The name was vaguely familiar, and Rashi had a brief recollection of it falling from Utakata's mouth in a hurried, whispered bid for kindness and sanctuary. Gaara looked towards the compound's entrance, and as if plucked from his memory, a girl with caramel-colored skin and mint-green hair cut above her shoulders stepped out from the shadowed enclave. Her eyes were downcast, and a blanket cloaked most of her body, adding to the appearance of a withdrawn little girl. She stopped just shy of the clustered trio, and Gaara continued as if her appearance and subsequent walk hadn't spanned a full minute. "Naruto, this is Fu. She desires your friendship." "Gaara!" Fu sounded horrified. Or embarrassed, he couldn't tell. "You're the one who helped Kiba, right?" Naruto was peering at her curiously, and Fu only seemed capable of a hesitant nod in answer to his question. Then the blonde's face broke into a wide smile. "You're awesome. Kiba was saying how you helped him kick the ass of that two-headed Otonin." Each word moved him progressively closer to her, until his bright grin was inches from her wide orange eyes. "Uzumaki Naruto, future Hokage. Nice to meet ya, Fu, thanks for all the help." And just like that, Fu's hesitation disappeared, replaced with her own beatific smile. "I'm just glad everything turned out okay. How's he do it?" It was a marvel that Naruto could ease someone's state of mind with just a few words and a sunny disposition, neither of which any other Jinchūriki could manage. Rashi wasn't even confident his niece could swing someone from one end of the emotional spectrum to the opposite as easily as Naruto did, and her life was far less burdened than his. They were chatting amicably now, companions with a lifetime of shared history, and Rashi found he could only shake his head at the turn of events. The sound of rustling clothes drew the redhead's attention, and he tilted his neck just enough to spy Utakata in his periphery. "I'm glad that she's finally talking to someone," the Kirinin said. Relief was evident in his voice. "Maybe now she won't be so angry. There's already enough that." Utakata stared at him for a moment, looking vaguely bemused. Was that a joke? Rashi was grateful he didn't have to respond to the younger Jinchūriki's smarminess, for Jiraiya appeared from the compound with a single clap of his hands and loudly stated, "Oh good, you're all here." A quick glance to the side showed Han leaning against the building's wall with his arms crossed over his armored chest, the eaves shadowing the upper half of his body. His attention returned to Jiraiya as the Sannin continued, "Now that I have some more details of the so-called Sasuke retrieval mission, I think we should have a discussion about what comes next." Utakata cleared his throat. "Sorry, what do you mean?" "Well," Jiraiya replied, as cheerful as Naruto, and Rashi wondered if that kind of joy was just an affliction all Leaf Shinobi were cursed with. Someone decided to tap into their Bijū's chakra, a heretofore unprecedented event, and one which cannot be ignored. So, as a result, we're going to learn how best to utilize and, more importantly, control this power. To that end, I'd like to discuss how the rest of you have learned to use your Bijū's chakra, or, in the alternative, discuss strategies to prevent losing control. Obviously this one doesn't have much to contribute, he added, jerking a thumb at Gaara, who, to the boy's credit, didn't react to the jibe. So who'd like to start? The nearby Jinchūriki exchanged glances, even Naruto unusually quiet, apparently reading the somber mood, and then Utakata cleared his throat again. We can communicate with the Bijū. In our heads, in a mindscape, I guess you'd say. Yagura, his voice caught, Adam's apple bobbing with a hard swallow, he said that the way to use the Bijū's power was to talk with them, come to an understanding. That's got to be dumbest. Dumber than trying to gather the Jinchūriki? Argued the Kirinin. Or staying to train Naruto. Or any one of the other half-dozen ideas I've had that's worked out. You're talking about making friends with a demon. Rashi snarled. Yagura's the Mizukage and the only one among us who has full control of his Bijū, so I think he knows what he's talking about in this instance. Yeah, Dawn, make a deal with devil. Okay, gents, Jiraiya interceded, let's put a pin in this and take 5. I'm not particularly interested in mediating this kind of conflict. Rashi let out an irritated huff and then turned and stormed off towards where Han was leaning against the building's wall. The armored shinobi watched him approach with brown eyes shadowed by his red kasa. You're not always right, you know. He closed one eye and turned slightly to glare at the steam user with the other. You're talking his side? You're the one who wants to make allies and amends, the giant noted sardonically. Unless your words ring as hollow now as they always have. The redhead's open eye narrowed perceptibly, it was a blatant call-out by his fellow rock shinobi. What's your point? I already told you, you're not always right. Why not prove that you're not too old to learn something new? Rashi scoffed quietly, closing his other eye in a bid to block out his surroundings and focus on calming his pricked temper. Hey, Han said, his deep voice not quite a bark but no less authoritative. The lava user opened his eyes to give the younger male his attention, but the five-tails Jinchūriki was looking straight ahead, and when Rashi followed his gaze, he spied Fu walking towards them, expression as downcast as it had been when she'd originally joined them outside. She didn't respond to his call, so Han uttered, "Girl," and she looked up at the pair with startled orange eyes. "Where are you going?" "Inside," came the quiet response. She'd reverted back to her withdrawn persona, perhaps intimidated by how different the pair of hidden rock Jinchūriki were from her peers. "Why? I can't, I'm not," she gesticulated randomly, unaware of what point she was trying to make. Her voice dropped even lower, a secret she was ashamed to divulge, "like you. I can't learn to use my Bijū's." The word seemed to physically choke the air from her lungs, a mixture of unfamiliarity and tepid admittance, ability. "What you're doing, it's impossible. I don't belong." She quieted as Han pushed himself off the wall and moved towards the green-haired girl with heavy steps. To her credit, Fu remained where she was as the giant approached, his height nearly double hers. A month ago, he stated, the steadiness of his baritone surprising Rashi, this entire situation would have been considered impossible. Whether you can use it now or not is irrelevant. You're a Jinchūriki, she twitched a little, if you belong anywhere, it is here. It surprised the redhead even more when Fu graced the taller Iwanin with a tentative smile, apparently finding comfort in his words. Han raised a hand and placed it atop her scalp. Rashi thought he might tousle her hair, as strange as the gesture would have been, both because it was Han doing it and because of the situation itself, but he simply guided her head so that she slowly turned with the motion until she was facing the way she'd come from. She seemed to accept his suggestion as a command, walking back to where the group of younger Jinchūriki were deep in conversation with Jiraiya. That was oh yeah, Rashi observed. Han grunted. Do you know about the mission they were on? Rashi scoffed. It wasn't of any importance to him what the shinobi of the leaf did, or the stupid decisions the younger and more impetuous Jinchūriki made. They fought shinobi of Otogekure. He failed to see the relevance. So? The Gobi Jinchūriki merely stared in response. Despite his natural impatience, Rashi didn't push for an answer, knowing that anything Han had given over the last month and would continue to give going forward was an improvement over his attitude from when they'd left Iwa. After a long minute, Han made a non-committal noise and then turned to face the other gathered Jinchūriki. It's of interest. Rashi rolled his eyes. PFT, fine. Keep your secrets. A call of his name drew his focus to the younger demon containers, where Naruto was waving one arm enthusiastically in a bid for the redhead's attention. With a shake of his head, he left the armored giant to his own devices and wandered towards his summoner, stepping up to the group and crossing his arms over his chest while 5 pairs of eyes watched. We'd like to hear your method of training, Jiraiya said, if you wouldn't mind sharing. And what changed your mind? Stupid fox doesn't want to talk, Naruto complained, lips turned in a dour frown. The Kyuubi has not been receptive to my methods, Utakata admitted. Shockin', was the redhead's wry retort. Probably better that way. I ain't one fair buddy way doin' it. Utakata frowned at the jibe, and the corner of Rashi's lips quirked in response. It was always fun to rile the brunette. Rashi, Jiraiya prompted, your method. Rashi spared him a long look, reading nothing off the white-haired man's carefully neutral expression. The Sannin was a man to be respected, the Iwanin's brief history with him bore that out, and he seemed to be invested in all the Jinchūriki, not just Naruto, which was novel. He wasn't used to people caring about him, about any jailer of a tailed beast, especially if that someone was his age, jaded by 2 great shinobi world wars and all the heartache and devastation associated with them. It was dangerous to trust anyone, especially someone who'd once been an enemy, and certainly wasn't a friend, even under these strange circumstances, but the Konohanin could probably be trusted with this. Yeah, take it. Jiraiya let out a long-suffering sigh that seemed out of place considering he wasn't the one who had to steal a Bijū's chakra. Yeah, I was afraid you'd say that. Nothing's ever easy with you. Sorry, Utakata interjected, you just take it? The lava user thought he sounded deeply offended by the suggestion, his delicate sensibility overrun by sheer impropriety. It was another reminder of how different the worlds they came from were, separated by generations and cultures that had been at odds since before they were born. Did you ever think that's why you have such a terrible relationship with the Yonbi? I think I care. The redhead retorted. Your way didn't work, so just sit back and shut up. He turned to give Naruto his full attention, ignoring the mixture of irritation and disapproval that painted the brunette's pale features. When he spoke again, his gruff voice lacked its usual edge. Yeah, used its power afore, I didn't ask, didn't plan, just took it, At Naruto's nod, he continued, then ya just need to remember how it felt to use it, and do it again. Naruto looked distinctly uncomfortable at his words. Jiraiya must have noticed as well, for he asked, you remember how it felt, right? Well, not really. Like, I got real pissed 'cause Sasuke was being an asshole, and then it just, I dunno, came out. Like how I taught ya katan. Yeah, kinda. It was like I could feel everything. There was this really dark presence, I think it was coming from Sasuke. And the water felt real comfortable, and the earth. Yeah, could feel earth. Naruto nodded eagerly. And heat? Another nod, then, I could use Yotan, too. Super easily. Rashi smirked, then turned to face Utakata. Yeah, ever feel like that when ya use Rokubi's chakra? The brunette blinked, clearly surprised to be addressed after having been dismissed. Well, yeah, I suppose so. Not in the same way, there's no heat, but it's like, I can feel how things are tied together. Chemically, like their energy, or their composition. It's easier with liquids, that's why I like bubbles or water, solids are more inert and gas is more volatile, but… Yeah, see, Rashi interrupted, directing his speech back at Naruto, that's power Bijū, tied to nature. Yeah, take their power, yeah, control nature. Painted Naruto's features, the same wide-eyed, slack-jawed expression that had colored the blonde's face dozens of times before when the Iwa or Kirinin had displayed some talent he'd found amazing. Jiraiya was cupping his chin in thought. What an interesting way to look at things, he mused. The Kyuubi's always been described as a force of nature, or a natural disaster, or a harbinger of one anyway. It always sounded like an old wives' tale, but maybe there's more truth to the stories than we thought. Yeah, should feel its chakra, the redhead said. Probably feels like a mix everything, hot and boilin' in. Dark eyes shifted over to Gaara, studying his position on the group's outskirts for just a moment. Meb a bit electric. I can feel it, Fu piped up. Her voice was quiet, and she seemed to shrink away from the eyes that focused on her, but an utterance of her name by Gaara straightened her spine and bolstered her confidence. When she spoke again, it was with a firmness he hadn't yet seen from her. It's kind of like all of that, and more. I don't really know how to describe it. You're a sensor, That's all kinds, useful. Yeah, can tell him when he's got it, assuming he can't figure it out himself. Naruto seemed to recognize the Yonbi Jinchūriki's tone, for his brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to, presumably, tap into the Kyuubi's chakra. Roshi's dark eyes wandered around to observe the other Jinchūriki as their attention turned to the blonde. Utakata was watching the younger boy speculatively, right hand cupped over his mouth in silent, hidden appraisal. The redhead could guess the Kirinin's thoughts, likely an echo of his earlier disapproval over the Iwanin's training methodology. It was familiar territory for the pair, though to the teenager's credit, it had been a while since they'd publicly disagreed. His gaze carried over to Fu, who was watching Naruto with an intensity that rivaled the blonde's own during a training session, and then Gaara, whose expressionless visage remained as unsettling as the lava user's memory of his predecessor's black-rimmed stare. And yet, they seemed to draw strength from each other, and while he knew nothing of the green-haired girl, it was nothing short of baffling to see a jailer of the Ichibi interact positively with another living being. Roshi mused on the inanity of it all, on how different things were from what he knew, all of them silent sentinels to the Leaf native struggles. They stood, watching, for almost an hour, Jiraiya intermittently offering pearls of wisdom for something beyond his comprehension and Fu making minor suggestions, until finally the kunoichi gasped and red-orange chakra sprang to life around the blonde. She shivered as if chilled by a winter wind and moved to stand behind Gaara, putting the redhead between herself and Naruto. Jiraiya whistled. "Hoo boy, I'm no censor, but even I can feel that. Glad I put up that barrier earlier, or all of Konoha'd be freaking out. So kid, now the question is, what can you do with it?" Utakata looked ready to protest, but Roshi shot him a scowl that had the brunette biting back his concerns. The redhead returned his attention to Naruto in time to see the younger boy form twin balls of lava in his hands and then pitch them towards the nearby pond. Steam erupted at the impact, then floated towards them in an unnatural path, washing them in humid air. Roshi kept a cautious eye on the vapor drowning them in heat, his fight with Han a reminder to be wary of steam in the hands of a Futon user. It appeared to sway in the still air, matching the back-and-forth flick of the orange-red fox tail sprouting from the base of Naruto's spine. Jiraiya made a noise the redhead thought might be derision. "All that just for a trip to the sauna? Come on kid, let's see what you've really got." Naruto rushed the white-haired man with a burst of speed that surpassed anything he'd shown in the months of training with the two older Jinchūriki. Jiraiya bent his knees and delivered a palm strike to the Leaf Genin's jaw that momentarily stunned the boy, then kicked up into the blonde's sternum. He growled as the blow lifted him off the ground, hands cupped together with a miasma of red-orange chakra coalescing between them. The chakra formed into a blackened sphere fractured by cracks of molten yellow-orange, a perfect, if smaller, replica of the Yonbi Jinchūriki's scorching stream rock technique. It shot from his palms, the Kyuubi's chakra already forming another, and Jiraiya began to hop from side to side to avoid each projectile. Even as gravity brought him to the earth, Naruto continued to form and fire balls of molten rock from his palms, each sphere getting larger and larger until Jiraiya was forced to hold his arm out and call chakra to his hand, a compressed sphere of bright blue whirling into existence. Roshi stared at the ball, a shiver of apprehension tickling down his spine. Rasengan. It had been a long time since he'd borne witness to the fourth Hokage's second trademark technique, and the fact that it still had an effect on him, well over a decade later, was a testament to its legacy. Jiraiya leaped towards the blonde with the Rasengan stretched forward, blowing the scorching stream rock technique into a shower of heated debris and charging into Naruto's personal space. The formation of another molten sphere was abandoned as the Rasengan came within inches of the boy, lava absorbed into the Sanin's blue chakra and spilling around them in viscous globules. Naruto leaned backwards, using his tail as a fulcrum so his body was parallel to the ground, and planted both legs into the older man's chest. Jiraiya grunted, stumbled backwards, then straightened up and laughed. "Well, can't say I expected that. Tricky little thing. Fine then, let's try this. Doton, Dosekadake." Spikes of earth erupted from the ground from every direction surrounding the blonde, each point lancing towards the boy with speedy precision. The Jinchūriki avoided the first two, but the third sliced across his bicep, the fourth impaled his thigh, and then a second tail sprouted next to the first one and twisted the boy into a controlled spin that broke each incoming spire of the earth and stone bamboo shoot technique. Behind Gaara, Fu seemed to shrink into herself a little more, orange eyes wide. Utakata stepped closer. "Roshi, I ain't blind," returned the redhead, his normal scorn absent. Dark eyes flickered between Naruto's two-tailed form and Jiraiya, the pair dancing around each other. Jiraiya ain't one to go down easy. Just wait. Doton, Yomi Numa. The ground in a 20-foot radius of the blonde turned to sludge as the swamp of the underworld took effect. Naruto howled, and the muck transformed into water, the sediments dropping out, and then began to evaporate, steam rising from the makeshift pond as a third tail grew from the Kyuubi's chakra. It choked the air from their lungs, Fu reaching for her throat and falling against Gaara, whose normally ambivalent expression was beginning to look pained. Roshi flared his own chakra, saturating the air with an intense heat that dried out the humidity and left the group sweating but able to breathe. Though he kept his focus on maintaining the shroud of heat that was preventing the superheated steam from harming them, the redhead's attention was drawn to the compound, where the clinking of Han's sectional armor was growing into a cacophony. His own curved daggers were straining against their holsters, the metal in their vicinity reacting to a powerful force. Even Jiraiya seemed to notice, letting out another boisterous laugh and joyously prodding, "Yeah, now we're getting somewhere. What can you do at this stage, I wonder?" In a frenetic whisper, Utakata urged, "Roshi, don't you think? Are ya daft?" The redhead shouted at Jiraiya. Beside him, Utakata took a surprised step back, apparently shocked the older Jinchūriki was finally intervening. "This training's gone too far, Jiraiya." "Yeah, Don, piss off a Jinchūriki. What's the worst that could, ngh?" Naruto's blitz sent the white-haired man careening backwards until he struck an invisible barrier and slumped to the ground. He lifted his head, only to have the blonde appear before him and deliver a hammer blow of hardened lava to his skull. His face hit the ground, then was lifted of its own accord by what felt like the pull of his forehead protector. One animalistic claw slashed a series of lines across his cheek, each cut burning like acid. Jiraiya disappeared in a quick body flicker as Naruto launched a flurry of incensed attacks. His thumb swiped a drop of blood from his cheek, fingers blurring through seals even as the blonde twisted to face him. He slammed his palm against the ground with a cry of, "Kuchiyos no Jutsu." As the demonic genin rushed forward, ramming into a bear-sized orange toad bearing metallic bracers that exploded into white smoke upon impact. The Sannin's hair tripled in size and twined itself protectively around him, its natural unkemptness hardening into spikes that Naruto appeared poised to break through. Fungo Kyaku. Han's erupting strong foot caught the younger Jinchūriki and sent him careening into the same invisible barrier Jiraiya had hit earlier. The older man's hair shrank, dark eyes peering at the armored shinobi curiously. "That's one beastly kick. You're in over your head," Han informed him, baritone frigid. He kept the Sannin at his back, maintaining a watchful eye on the Ninetales Jinchūriki. "Whatever your intentions, you do not go to Jinchūriki, especially not one who is inexperienced in controlling their Bijū." "Ha, maybe I did go a little too far." Naruto bellowed in fury, bubbling orange-red becoming shrouded in black as his skin began to peel off, blood vaporizing and darkening his chakra cloak. "Yes," Han agreed in the same unyielding tone. Steam erupted from his armor with a hiss of depressurization nearly lost among the continued clinking of the metal pieces. The steam propelled him forward as the miasma of dark chakra around the blonde grew. "Funswiken." He clotheslined the genin, knocking him backwards against the barrier again. The vapor surrounding them seemed to react to the boy's mutating chakra, a power struggle between originator and manipulator, and then Han reached through the foul chakra to cover the boy's face with his palm, thick fingers clutching his temples, and slammed the blonde's head into the barrier. Naruto howled, claws and tails lashing out against scarlet armor without success, and more steam erupted from the armor as the Iwanin repeatedly battered his skull against the invisible wall with concussive force. Naruto's chakra cloak dissipated as the continuous blows finally rendered him unconscious. Han let the beaten boy drop unceremoniously to the ground, then turned to face Jiraiya and warningly intoned, "You are lucky he could be contained before entering his version 2 state." One white eyebrow arched in curiosity. "And what, pray tell, is a version 2 state?" The Steam user didn't immediately respond, staring Jiraiya down with an intensity that Roshi assumed his fellow rock shinobi thought was intimidating. Maybe it was, he mused, but the Sannin was unaffected, hardened, like Roshi himself, by too many decades of life to flinch at a stern look. For a long moment, all was quiet, the gathered Jinchūriki watching the standoff with bated breath. Then, chakra exploded from the armored shinobi, his massive form falling to all fours as a skin of red and black encompassed him, leaving round white eyes devoid of humanity. 5 long tails twitched behind him, breath steaming out from an open maw framed by serrated teeth. Roshi shuddered as Han's chakra washed over them all, a simian shriek he hadn't heard in years echoing within his skull. He brought a hand to his temple, disguising the motion by scratching at his red hair, forcing dark eyes to focus on the other demon containers. Utakata, to his credit and the redhead's surprise, was silent, only a speculative look and slightly pallid tone to his already pale skin belying his reaction. Fu looked to be on the verge of throwing up, sweat dripping down her face and pallor notably off color. The sensation of so much demonic energy, especially to someone so sensitive to chakra, was likely overpowering. Beside her, Gaara's expression appeared, hungry, the naked desire on the boy's normally unflappable features, a concerning regression in the face of all the progress Rashi had noted throughout the day. Han! He snapped. Yevi proved your point. And just like that, the oppressive chakra disappeared, and Han rose smoothly to his feet, right hand sliding beneath his GI to rest over his heart as he walked past a pensive Jiraiya and towards the compound. He paused next to Rashi and muttered darkly, and so Konoha is like all the rest, looking for ways to increase its presence on the world stage by any means necessary. How reassuring. Yeah, stopped, didn't, yeah, I shouldn't have to, was the giant's acerbic retort, and I won't again. Rashi's eyes followed him as he returned to the shadow of the overhang, only to be distracted by Jiraiya taking his fellow Iwanin's place, looking far too nonchalant for what they'd all just experienced. Well, that was something, admitted the Sannin. I'm a big enough man to admit that I took that farther than I should've. Yeah, think so. Sarcasm oozed past his lips. Meb, that's 'cause I told that took it too far. To be fair, I had no idea what would happen. Konoha's never invested effort to train its Jinchūriki to that extent before, so why start now? Akatsuki's out there looking for all of you, doing who knows what, and they're not to be trifled with. I'd feel better knowing the kid's got an ace up his sleeve to help him out of a sticky situation rather than risk him getting captured because we were all too scared of what the Kyuubi could do to find out what Naruto can do. Besides, who better than you guys to help teach him how to control a Bijū? And now we at least know some of the lengths we can take the kid's training. Rashi let out another annoyed huff, recognizing the Leaf Shinobi's point yet too stubborn to admit it aloud. Anyway, I think that's enough for now. I'll come up with a better training regimen in the future. In the meantime, he reached into his vest and pulled out a small scroll, holding it out to the redhead. Do me a favor and give this to the kid when he wakes up. Little congrats present for making genin. Slightly belated birthday gift, too, I guess, he mused to himself. I ain't your errand boy. True, which is why I said it was a favor. I've gotta go take care of some more pressing business, otherwise I'd do it myself. Rashi raised a skeptic eyebrow, and Jiraiya grinned at him. You're not gonna make me beg, are you? Humph. He took the scroll and tucked it into his own shirt for safekeeping. Whatever ya say. Jiraiya tossed him a jaunty salute and then strolled out the Senju complex, leaving Rashi surrounded by 5 Jinchūriki in various states of emotional and physical turmoil. He inhaled heavily through his nose, suddenly exhausted. That could gone better. Chapter 17, The Slug's Souvenir. The white masks of the Mist Anbu, plain but for a single, colored shape, each one unique to its wearer, remained immobile as he approached. The administrative building was an impressive, stout cylinder of red-roofed shingles decorating 2 stories arranged like the bread layers of a sandwich. Between them was a layer of square windows tinted so that the sunlight shone blue against them, preventing anyone from seeing in, but giving the Mizukage an ideal vantage point to watch over the village. Yagura was there now, perhaps watching his approach. Utakata continued walking forward, furtively glancing at the looming archway that marked the building's entrance. A fluttering mixture of excitement and nerves built in his gut as the heavy wooden doors appeared more imposing with each step. He never even heard the swords leave their sheaths, but the pair of katanas barring his path sent his stomach tumbling with dread. Step back, ordered one of the Anbu. I'm here to be assessed as the Mizukage's bodyguard, he replied cordially. You're ineligible. I didn't realize there were requisites to apply. The brunette's voice was an echo of his master Harasame, neutral yet leading. There isn't. You are ineligible. I'm not sure, he trailed off, the thought reaching its conclusion in his mind. Ah! It wasn't his credentials that were in question, but rather his status. The Mizukage wasn't in charge of choosing his own bodyguards, and whomever was likely didn't want one Jinchūriki protecting another. If Yagura was busy running the village, Utakata couldn't be allowed to watch over him, he instead needed to be available for anything else the village required. Disappointment slumped his shoulders as he turned away from the 2 Anbu and made the long, slow trek back to the bubble user's compound. Now what? Utakata watched the other Jinchūriki from his spot by the Senju compound's pond, golden gaze unfocused. Fu and Gaara were sparring under Han's discerning eyes, the armored shinobi a sentinel to his junior's training. In stark contrast to the Iwa Nin, Fu was darting around the Sunanin, throwing quick jabs at her fellow genin with hands covered by swirling winds. Since the pair had returned from their self-ascribed mission weeks before, the green-haired girl had come around to embrace their situation, a complete turn from her first month in Konoha. She was chipper and energetic and, unburdened, he mused, not wholly dissimilar from Naruto. It reminded him of her joy when he'd promised to take her away from the hidden waterfall. Even Gaara's attitude in the interim weeks seemed different. Nothing so obvious as Fu's, she'd at least shown some capacity for happiness when they'd initially met, but he was less standoffish now, though he tended to stick close to Fu or Han, even if the latter seemed to be in a training capacity only. That they were able to grow with each other was a net positive in Utakata's eyes, especially since Naruto had not been around much to facilitate their interaction, something he'd been counting on. He supposed that whatever adventure Gaara and Fu had been on had forged a bond that allowed them to serve as a surrogate Naruto for each other, with the real blonde reinforcing that connection at the sporadic times he was around. The Leaf native's frequent absence was due to the plethora of missions Tsunade kept sending him on now that he'd been promoted to genin, an announcement that had surprised Utakata and his seniors more than the two younger Jinchūriki, judging by Gaara's stoicism and Fu's cheer. Or, a cynical part of the brunette posited, and Rashi had grunted in presumed agreement when he'd mentioned it, it was the follies of youth. It hadn't escaped his notice that the older redhead tended to make himself scarce when Naruto's rotating band of teammates, a large group of genin his age, though rarely the same assembly of 2 or 3 people, showed up to the Senju compound to collect him. He would be lying if he couldn't admit that the sight of the 3 youngest Jinchūriki together didn't spark an ember of envy. It reminded him all too keenly of his friendship with Yagura, of his years-long failure to protect the gray-haired boy from the evil influence controlling him. Han stepped forward to correct Gaara's form, and Utakata found himself immersed in his own sparring sessions with Yagura, ducking the smaller boy's laughably large staff and learning how to bend his slight form around every attack thrown at him. A sad smile crept around his mouth, the sudden weight of the memories as suffocating as his friend's rough sea spewing technique. Not for the first time, he wondered when Yagura had fallen under the control of Akatsuki, and how he hadn't seen it. Or maybe he hadn't seen it because it had only occurred after his friend had taken up the mantle of leadership. The moment he'd been turned away from applying to be the Mizuki's personal guard had haunted him for 2 years, right up until he'd fled the village, a failed attempt to retain the close friendship he'd spent 6 years cultivating. Hey, Naruto's back! Utakata's head snapped up towards the compound's main entrance at Fu's announcement, finding the blonde waving an energetic goodbye to his latest team, a black-haired boy wearing a vivid green jumpsuit, a female brunette with hair twisted into 2 buns, and a male brunette with white eyes and a no-nonsense countenance. It was hard to tell, but it looked like the white-eyed boy offered someone, Fu or Gaara, a curt nod of his head before turning and leaving with his team, a boisterous yell from the green-clad male accompanying their departure. Fu raced ahead and threw her arms around the blonde, Gaara following sedately behind her and stopping a respectful distance from the pair. He certainly has a charisma about him, Han noted, deep voice carrying notes of Rashi's wry humor to Utakata's trained ears as he joined the Kirinin. That he attracts so many different personalities is the mark of a unifying figure. Utakata shot him a sidelong glance. So you think he can be the Hokage? Hokage? The word was delivered with a scoff. Is that his objective? Like anyone in our position would ever be selected. Yagura. The Mizuki, yes. And I'm sure he was eager to take the mantle, chose it of his own volition. Utakata found himself mute in the face of the older Jinchūriki's searing sarcasm, his words an accurate reminder that Yagura had been forced into the role in an effort by the Hidden Mist's hierarchy to grow the village's power and prestige. Duty is a tedious thing. Those with our affliction don't seek the impossible. Utakata considered the armored shinobi's words, watching the 3 younger demon containers converse with an ease that hadn't existed upon his first observation of each of them. Rashi said something pretty similar when we first started out, he rebutted quietly. Repeatedly. But I think what we've accomplished so far is a pretty clear sign that the impossible is not as out of reach as you Iwa think it is. Han scoffed again, arms crossed over his broad chest, and he looked so much like a larger version of Rashi silently conceding defeat that the Kirinin couldn't help but grin. He left the older shinobi at his back, moving towards the trio of genin with a hand raised in greeting to Naruto's exuberant wave. Another exciting mission, Naruto. Golden eyes swept over the blonde's form, taking note of the wear and tear displayed prominently across his new uniform. Jiraiya's gift, a cross between a graduation and birthday present, according to the older man's note, was a gray hoodie with a zipper and convenient front pockets. The long sleeves were decorated with a stripe of orange that contrasted the dark blue pants that fell to his ankles. Apparently the design was very similar to what his father had worn as a genin, which was probably why Naruto had taken to wearing the outfit with unbridled glee. You bet! I was just tellin' Gaara and Fu about how Raiga threw this huge lightning. Sorry, Utakata interrupted, visible golden eye wide. Did you just say Raiga? Kurisuke Raiga? Naruto scratched his temple with a finger, offering the brunette an embarrassed grin. Heh, maybe. Don't know his full name. Green hair? Utakata probed, the question striking like a bolt of lightning. Lots of bandages? He'd probably look similar to this, he added, and with a quick sign, he was engulfed in a cloud of smoke as the transformation technique took effect. Naruto's blue eyes gleamed with recognition. Hey, yeah! That's a pretty good likeness, Utakata and I. You know him. The illusion fell when Gaara and Fu's gazes swiveled to him as well, 3 pairs of curious eyes waiting for a response. He was once a member of Kirigakure's 7 shinobi swordsmen, if one of ill repute. His explanation was slow, measured, a recollection of information gathered in years of self-learning. They didn't react to the name, and he wondered how far his home village had fallen that their shinobi with the greatest renown had no name recognition to other villages, so he elaborated, the 7 shinobi swordsmen are, or were, I suppose, the best of the best, Kirigakure's elite fighting force. Not only were they experts in silent killing, but they were masters of kenjutsu. Unparalleled. Together, it was rumored they could annihilate an entire country. Their swords only made them more famous, or infamous, as it were. Each one was designed to do something different, with its own unique ability, and they could only be passed down upon the death of the wielder. Raiga, he used Rado, twin swords that could channel both natural and chakra-based lightning to cut through anything. He got them from a kunoichi named Ringo Amuri, who he killed while she was lying sick in bed. Amuri was revered. The first and only kunoichi to ever join the swordsmen, people idolized her. Understandably, the nature of her murder didn't go over well with the people of Kirigakure. See, even though Kirigakure has a reputation of being bloodthirsty, it prides itself on combat and winning in battle. The way Raiga killed Amuri was cowardly, it went against everything Kirigakure stood for. So he fled, taking the Rado Kiba with him. He cleared his throat, the history lesson wearing on him. I'm sorry for interrupting your story, Naruto, but what happened to Raiga? Did he have Kiba? Oh, yeah. He had a couple swords. And he was real big on lightning. But he, fell over a cliff? I think the swords went with him. Utakata cursed under his breath, but quickly schooled his disappointment and hopefully probed, Naruto, where was this mission? Katabami, something. Sorry, Niji was in charge. It was in the land of rivers, about a day and a half away. Much appreciated. The brunette turned on his heels and walked back into the compound. His room was one of the closest to the entrance, and he entered with a swish of his kimono. Golden eyes flitted around, directing him to a rucksack Naruto had bought for him during an outing through the village. He took the rucksack to the kitchen and began to rifle through the cabinets, grabbing a medley of non-perishables and throwing them in the bag. What are you doing? He turned at Fu's voice, finding her watching his movements from the entryway. I need to find Kiba. So you're leaving, just for a little bit. He returned to foraging through the cabinets for food, only pausing when a caramel-colored hand waved a small tin can before his eyes. Utakata grabbed it, turning it so that he could read the label. No thanks, I'm not big on natto. It's for me, Fu told him, a touch exasperated. You shouldn't go by yourself, and 2 pairs of eyes are better than 1. Utakata almost protested, then decided better of it. Though he knew a great deal about the history of the swordsman and each sword's ability, the origins of the blades themselves were shrouded in mystery and mythology. At a minimum, Samahata, Hiramakariai, and Kubikurabocho were all imbued with chakra. If Kiba was similar, Fu's sensing abilities could be a great asset. Instead, he placed the natto in the rucksack and offered her a nod of acknowledgement. When he felt he had enough supplies, he left the kitchen and ventured back into the courtyard, Fu trailing behind him. Hey, Gaara, Naruto! She shouted. Wanna come on an adventure with us? We're gonna find the swords Utakata was talking about. Naruto let out a whoop. Yeah! Beside him, Gaara looked between the leaf and waterfall genin, then bobbed his head once in agreement. Ah, well. Utakata began, caught flat-footed, while I appreciate the support, Naruto, you're an official shinobi, and you can't leave without the Hokage's permission. Aw man. The brunette offered him a crooked grin. You've done more than enough at this point, thank you. Although, if you could maybe inform Tsunade of our whereabouts, that might help, smooth things over when we return. And I can't ask you to go with us, he directed to Gaara. Teal eyes blinked at him, slow and methodical. You didn't. Utakata didn't know what to make of the younger boy's response, but since it didn't seem an outright rejection, and Fu was grinning cheerily at him, he assumed the redhead was joining their team. He turned to Han, who was lurking nearby, and politely offered, if you'd like. Pass, came the giant's swift, curt response. One large, gloved hand came to rest on Naruto's shoulder. You have training to do. Naruto's expression waffled between excited and disappointed, granting the remaining demon containers a mournful glance that he couldn't join them. When the Iwa-nin had steered the blonde away, Utakata glanced at the two remaining genin, both of whom were watching him expectantly. Well, I guess we're ready to go then. But for the sound of shoes landing or leaping from branches, silence reigned among the trio. Fu had to keep slowing down to allow her two companions to keep up, her apparent familiarity with tree-hopping leagues ahead of Utakata and Gaara's. The brunette rued that he couldn't use his drifting bubble, but the idea of being in an enclosed space with Gaara, who struck him as uncomfortable, at best, when confined, made that a dangerous option. So they traveled the old-fashioned way, which was tedious, but at least the land of fire offered them a scenic view. Utakata smiled despite his uncharitable thoughts, at least someone was enjoying herself. I have a question. The Kirinin turned to Gaara, who was watching him apathetically. Yes. Your interest in these swords seems to transcend intellectual curiosity. They are important. I do not understand why. They're of significant cultural and military significance to Kirigakure. Yet you are no longer a denizen of your village, Gaara pointed out with bland indifference. Your allegiance is to the group you have formed, is it not? Fu slowed down so that she was keeping pace with them, backwards glances allowing orange eyes to flicker between the pair as best she could while still one jump ahead. You have not displayed a proficiency in handling weapons or Raiton chakra that would suggest this mission is intended to improve your own skills. Therefore, its purpose is of great personal import to you specifically. Stunned by the Sand Genin's analysis, Utakata couldn't formulate a reply before Fu piped up. Is this part of your plan to rescue Yagura? They're separate issues, he managed. Inoichi says that to solve an issue, you must identify its root cause. Utakata stared at the redhead, again unable to find a response, and Gaara met the teenager's gaze with his own even look. After a long moment where neither seemed inclined to elaborate further, the brunette sighed. My father was one of the 7 shinobi swordsmen, he explained. There was a moment of silence in which he considered what else to divulge, and as the weight of his companion's gazes continued to bore into him, he quietly admitted, he wielded kiba. Fu jerked at the revelation, fumbling her jump and releasing a breathy gasp. Gaara didn't seem to react, instead commenting, you mentioned a kunoichi named Amuri. I know, he interrupted, an uncharacteristic bite to his voice, and she was. But she took over from my father. He died fighting the Sanbai when I was 2, in the same fight that almost killed the previous Rokubi Jin container, he corrected, eyes flicking to Fu. I got Saiken, and Amuri got Kiba. So yes, you're right that this is personal. But there's more to it than that. See, Kirigakure has been in steady decline for a while now, despite having 2 Bijū and the 7 shinobi swordsmen. The Sandaime Mizukichi started a tradition of having academy students fight to the death in order to graduate, which both halved our forces and gave us the reputation of being bloodthirsty and savage. It was the hope of the village's hierarchy that, by raising a Kage who also contained the Sanbai, the village would reclaim some of its original glory. Yagura was supposed to reverse Kirigakure's trajectory. It didn't work. When Yagura took over, Kirigakure's history of bloodshed spread. The graduation ceremony continued, and we exacerbated a systematic purge of clans with Kekei Genkai that, until recently, had been more of a pattern of local discrimination and isolated attacks. Since last year, or, well, a year before I left anyway, Kirigakure has been embroiled in an escalating civil war that has set those with Kekkai Genkai and their supporters against the institution that's been in control since before I was born. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, Gaara intoned. Yes, I suppose so, Utakata acknowledged, surprised at the younger boy's insight, although it wasn't without rebellion. Several of the 7 shinobi swordsmen fought back against what was happening, but none were successful. I already told you what happened with Amuri and Raiga, but 3 others, Zabuza, Jinpachi, and Jinin, all tried and failed to overthrow the Mizukichi. Jinpachi was killed to set an example, Zabuza and Jinin fled the village. Kushimaru and Kisame stayed loyal, but Kisame's really working for Akatsuki, and Kushimaru was killed by Rashi. Mangetsu was killed on a mission not long before I left. Rashi must be very strong to have beaten someone you refer to as elite. There was a note of longing in Gaara's voice, and when the bubble user glanced at him, his normally flat eyes seemed to be gleaming with hunger. Gaara! Fu warned sharply, and the redhead's gaze immediately snapped to her. He shook his head, and when his feet propelled him forward on the next jump, the look was gone. Thank you. Fu turned towards Utakata. When we were in the Hokage's office, you gave her a sword Tsu. Was that? That was Kushimaru's weapon, Nuabari. He cleared his throat, unsure how to properly segue out of the younger pair's interaction. The swords provide clout. As I said, Kirigakure has been struggling for a long time, and returning something of such cultural, military, and historic significance could offer us leverage. For what? Fu asked. Do you think you're gonna bargain with people who don't care about you, Tsu? Utakata opened his mouth to reply and again found no words. Fu had a point, especially given her experience in the Hidden Waterfall, and that wasn't even taking into account that he was a wanted man whom the Hidden Mist's hierarchy wouldn't be willing to negotiate with. He swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. Kirigakure needs new leadership. If we're able to get Yagura out of there, change the status quo, then maybe. They'll come in handy, I'm sure of it, he reiterated with more confidence than he felt. We just need to get Yagura out of there. It sounds as if you care for Yagura a great deal, Gaara observed. He's the only person who really understood what it was like to grow up like me. When things got to be too much, we always had each other. The brunette nearly bit his tongue, bitterly reminded of his failure. Before Yagura became the Mizukichi, I promised that I would watch over and protect him. He used to call me Utakata and I. Naruto calls you that. Utakata smiled sadly. Yes, I'd noticed. He and Yagura aren't so different, and apparently where Yagura considered me his older brother, so does Naruto. But when it mattered most, I failed to protect Yagura. I'm hoping to rectify that, not just with Naruto, or by saving Yagura, but, he shrugged, unsure what more needed to be said. So yes, you could say I care about him. We didn't really have anyone or anything else. Gaara was watching him with the same blank visage that seemed a permanent fixture of his persona, his mood unreadable. As the silence among them dragged, Utakata began to feel guilt edge around his conscience. The months of dealing with Rashi's pessimism had taught him that he apparently had his own short fuse when it came to the Three Tails Jinchūriki, and Gaara, his apparent sociopathy notwithstanding, didn't deserve his snark. He opened his mouth to offer an apology, but Gaara's raspy monotone gave him pause. Recently, Inoichi and I have been talking about family. Despite the boy's stoicism, Utakata found himself intrigued by his junior's comment, curious to its relevance. In our sessions, I have noticed he often draws a comparison to his own teammates, calling them brothers in arms. He paused, teal eyes swallowing their surroundings, seemingly lost in the moment. Utakata arched an eyebrow in Fu's direction, silently asking her if this was normal when she finally caught his gaze. The Takinin shrugged, orange eyes flickering to Gaara, apparently waiting for him to continue. After several seconds, the Sangenin seemed to recover his thought process, continuing blandly, he often tries to impress the importance of these people, as if a familial association makes them special. But I have siblings who also served as my teammates, and they were tedious. Weak, unimportant, afraid, they were a means to an end my father imposed upon me. That we share blood does not make them important. Gaara. Utakata held up a hand to forestall the rest of Fu's melancholic whisper. Do you think that may be because you never had a relationship with your siblings? Gaara stared at him, and as several seconds passed, his head slowly tilted to the side, teal eyes blinking lethargically. The motion made him seem bird-like, and in the moment, the Kirinine thought that he might be able to interpret the redhead's strange mannerisms. He appeared to be learning everything anew, a child studying those around him. Just because you have siblings doesn't mean you automatically know what a sibling relationship is like. You need to actually have the relationship. After another long pause, Gaara turned away, unable or unwilling to continue meeting the older Jinchūriki's gaze. That is something to consider. Someone's near. Utakata tilted his head towards Fu, Gaara mirroring his movement on her opposite side. They were only a couple hours into the land of rivers, traveling in quiet ease after the emotionally charged conversation from the day before. Gaara had offered, more like insisted, in his flat rasp, to keep watch the previous night, and despite his initial unease, the Kirinine had acquiesced, eventually falling into a deep sleep. Now rejuvenated both physically and mentally, he was focused on the mission at hand, following Fu's exuberant pace and trusting her direction. Could it be the village by the mine? The Takinine shook her head. It's only 5 people, and they're moving like us. Definitely shinobi. What should we do? Surprised by the question, Utakata turned from the kunoichi's open curiosity to Gaara's blank expression, looking for an opinion and receiving nothing in return. To the green-haired girl, he asked, "You're in the lead, what do you think?" "Yeah, but you're the leader, Sue." Another glance at Gaara was greeted with silence, although this time the boy gave a slow, single nod of agreement. "I'm flattered, you think so," he managed, "but we're supposed to be a team, and I trust your judgment." Fu seemed to glow with the praise, and Utakata mused that additional positive reinforcement might help to continue breaking the Takinine out of her shell. There was a moment of quiet while she appeared to focus on her sensory abilities, then, "I think we can avoid them. Follow me." She veered sharply to the south and the 2 boys followed, and after a half-minute of travel, Fu hesitantly said, They changed their path. I think they're following us." Concern began to bubble in his gut, and he forced himself to be calm when he probed, "Are you sure?" Fu nodded, managing a hurried, "They're moving faster now. Let's outrun them." "Unlikely," Gaara stated. "I cannot sustain a greater pace than our current one." "Okay." Utakata allowed, mind whirling, "Then we're going to have to incapacitate them." Gaara's eyes appeared to glimmer with the same madness from the day before, an expression the brunette was beginning to realize was probably bloodlust. "That idea has merit." The Kirinine scrutinized the younger Jinchūriki, trying to judge someone he still knew far too little about and who seemed to be in the process of fighting a slew of personal demons. "Can you control yourself?" Teal eyes snapped to him. "Well enough," he said, and his voice sounded almost normal. Of all the traits he'd observed so far, lying did not seem like something the redhead embraced, so Utakata decided to take him at his word. "Alright, then let's find a more advantageous location. Fu, keep an eye on them." The kunoichi tossed him a casual salute as he passed her to take the lead, maintaining their speed while keeping his head on a swivel for any sign of better terrain. It only took a couple minutes of travel for the sound of running water to make its way to his ears, and he steered their group in the direction of one of the land of river's multiple namesakes. The trees opened into a grotto with a small cave whose mouth was protected by flowing water. They stopped in front of the cave, and after scanning their surroundings, Utakata turned to Gaara. "You're good with defense, right? I was raised a weapon." "So were we all," the Kirinine replied, "but that's not what I asked." Gaara stared at him, unblinking, and after an agonizing wait, wherein Utakata wanted to yell that time was of the essence, finally bobbed his head once. "Good. Fu and I will take the lead on offense, and you cover any blind spots from the cave so they can't see you or where your attacks are coming from." He received another nod, this one much more responsive, and as the sand shinobi stalked towards the hideaway, the brunette plucked his bubble blower from where it was tucked inside his obi. Loading it with solution, he brought it to his lips and blew out a slew of bubbles. Wonder dawned on Fu's face as countless spheres spread out around them, dappled sunlight refracting rainbow colors off their surfaces. Utakata watched her joy, musing that this was one of the first times, if not the first time, that the green-haired girl had seen him use Shibandama. Most of their training at the Senju compound focused on taijutsu, and when Utakata served as Naruto's teacher, it was mostly just to refine the boy's suiton. "It's a start," he said. "What can they do?" "A lot. Keep your distance. And let me know when they're near." "They're pretty close." "Alright, get ready." A thick drizzle swept through the clearing, and Utakata's bubbles dissolved into the rain. Golden eyes widened with surprise and a small amount of fear. "Kira-same, so then. He ducked the first water whip that shot out towards him from the woods, but the second one lashed around his ankles and bound his legs together. There was a tug, and he crashed to the ground with a yelp. Fu shouted his name, dashing forward and severing his bindings with a slice of her arm. She took up guard around him while he scrambled back to his feet, scanning their surroundings for any inkling of the hunter-nin hiding just beyond his sight. "What's going on?" Fu asked. "This rain is full of chakra, it's hard to sense anything." "It's Kirasame," Utakata explained hurriedly, a jutsu used by Kirigakure's Oinin to absorb any manifested chakra of the people they hunt. "It's especially effective against my Shibandama, which is why they're using it. They're after you." "Indeed," intoned a new voice, deep with authority. 3 figures stepped out of the forest, all dressed in neutral colors contrasted by the nearly stark white masks of Bijū that disguised their identity. The lead Kirinin took several more steps forward and removed his mask, revealing a pale face with a trim goatee and a long scar cutting through his left eye. "Utakata!" The brunette grimaced, returning the hunter-nin's greeting with a curt, "Tsurugi." Back in the hidden mist, he'd only known of the man by reputation as an Oinin division sub-leader, one of the few people in the running to eventually replace Kushimaru as the wielder of Nuibari. The scar was a memento of an ugly training session with the now-deceased swordsman, a story that had spread through the village like wildfire. There would likely be no negotiating with him. "Utakata, I'm offering you a single opportunity to turn yourself in, and your companions can leave unharmed. Should you resist, there will be no mercy." "Well, that's more generous than I was expecting. He's not going anywhere," Fu retorted. Her heated defense took him by surprise, and if it wasn't for the situation at hand, he thought the support might have overwhelmed him. As it was probably ill-timed. "Tsurugi, wait." The hunter-nin slipped his mask back on. "So be it." An odachi was removed from its sheath, the 3-foot blade held threatening in front of him. He charged the brunette, bringing the blade in a downward slice that nearly removed his right arm. Only a last-minute dive to the left saved the limb. Utakata hastened to his feet, only to immediately gag as something wrapped around his throat, constricting his airway. His hands scrabbled against the threat, working fruitlessly against a mass of liquid as his vision began to blur. He gasped as the noose loosened, golden eyes opening amidst a coughing fit to find Fu leaning down beside him. "Come on," she urged, and then immediately spun around, a raised arm slicing through an incoming water whip like a blade. "Someone else is comin'." Utakata spun her out of the way of a second swing of Tsurugi's odachi, grunting when the older mist shinobi kicked his unprotected back. "Shouldn't Gar be helping?" he hissed. "Probably." She spun around him and sliced through another water whip and the wave of electricity that followed behind it. Assured that she seemed to be able to take care of herself, and pushing the missing in-action Sunanin from his mind, Utakata turned to face Tsurugi, racing through viable combat options while the mist rain technique was in effect. Without ninjutsu, he was forced to resort to taijutsu, which seemed to be working for Fu, but it didn't explain how the green-haired girl was so easily countering the Oinin's elemental techniques. His periphery caught her negate another burst of water, the spray repelled outward off her forearm. "She's using futon, I guess Kirasame doesn't stop chakra being emanated off the user?" That was an interesting tidbit he'd have to keep in mind for any future conflicts. Tsurugi's fingers twisted through one-handed seals, liquid orbs the size of his head coagulating from the mist. Utakata began to dodge each of the drizzle technique's projectiles, keeping an eye on the swordsman and nimbly twisting his body around the odachi's slashes when they came. With each move, he allowed the protective chakra coating his body to dissipate until only the Rokubi's gift remained, his acid armor giving him some measure of confidence with his taijutsu. When the odachi came at him again, water swirling around the blade, the brunette focused chakra to his hand and caught the weapon on its downswing. The metal melted with a sizzle, the sword's tip falling to the ground as the six-tails acid ate through the blade. If the Oinin was surprised, his mask hit it, but Utakata managed to slam his left fist into the porcelain while he was momentarily flat-footed. When Tsurugi staggered back and looked up, an imprint of the Jinchūriki's fist was missing from his mask, revealing a portion of the right side of his face. He glanced at the remaining 2 feet of blade still attached to the hilt and then threw it to the side. "So you've learned some new tricks in your time away." "I just leaned into who I am." Tsurugi made an indistinct noise and then removed the mask, dropping it near his discarded sword. "So be it." A loud creak caught their attention, the pair looking over in time to jump apart from the shadow of a collapsing tree that hit the earth and stopped all fighting. Standing over the broken base of the tree was a man with a square jaw and short brown hair receding from his large forehead. His face was dark, like cocoa, but as Utakata watched, it faded to a rough tan, a scar clear on his left temple. The rest of his body was hidden by a black cloak decorated with large red clouds that sent dread shuddering down the brunette's spine. Oh no! Fu, we need to go. So, Kakuzu, what do you think? From the shadow of the first Akatsuki nin stepped a second, this one at least a foot taller, head covered by a gray hood and black face mask, leaving only lurid, pupilless green eyes visible. Clenched in his hand was the head of a Kirinin, the shinobi's body flaccid beside him. With a casual movement, he tossed the corpse into the clearing, where it rolled to a stop, a large gash evident in his chest. Green eyes flitted across the gathered shinobi, from Fu to the two Kirinin she was fighting, then to Utakata and finally Tsurugi. Those two, he said in a deep baritone that reminded Utakata a little of Han's voice. Utakata and Biwa Tsurugi, both valuable bounties. Fu! He hissed. Get the hell out of here. Fu! She wasn't moving, and Utakata moved away from Tsurugi to get closer to her. She appeared catatonic, orange eyes wide with terror, and he wondered if the reality of what they were up against, what all the Jinchūriki were up against, was finally hitting her. Another shout of her name finally drew her wide-eyed gaze to him, and when she finally spoke, it was only to whisper, "That's Kakuzu. This rain is annoying. I leave them to you, Kansuchi. He's after me, not you, so go." Go! Utakata repeated when she didn't respond. Go where? Utakata whirled on the spot to be greeted by a hammer blow that sent him soaring towards the cave they'd left Gaara. He crawled to his knees with a groan, looking around to find the dark-skinned, brown-haired Akatsuki nin, Kansuchi, he presumed, stalking towards him. Kansuchi stomped the ground, and a jagged series of earthen spikes raced towards him, but something lifted him off the ground and carried him into the cave, narrowly avoiding impalement. He glanced over to find Gaara's hand stretched out with the palm up, manipulating the sand beneath him. Thank you, but what have you been doing? Sand and water do not mix, intoned the redhead. The silica beneath the brunette disappeared, only to reform as a veil blocking the cave entrance that shielded them from an incoming punch. It exploded into individual granules that immediately reformed to protect them, and Gaara grunted, he hits as hard as Han. I cannot hold this long. They're after me, the brunette said hurriedly. Something's wrong with Fu. Teal eyes snapped to his face, holding golden irises in a deadly gaze. What is wrong with Fu? Utakata shook his head and divested himself of his kimono. I don't know, but I need you to get her out of here. And take this with you, he added, holding his clothing out for the redhead. You can take these men by yourself. I'm not sure, but if I can give you and her the opportunity to escape, we need to take it. The redhead's stare remained unwavering for a long moment, despite the Akatsuki nin beating his barrier, and when he finally released it, taking the kimono wordlessly, he said, You are a good leader. Utakata didn't know what to say to the younger Jinchūriki's admittance, but in the next instant, the sand barrier dropped and Kansuchi charged into the cave. The brunette blazed through seals as chakra built in his chest. Fun Shaisen. Greenish liquid blasted from his mouth and hit the Akatsuki nin in the chest, drawing a laugh from the man. You think that'll stop me? My Doton, Domu is as hard as steel, you're not gonna do anything with, ah. He hissed, scratching at his chest and sidestepping the stream's range. Utakata cut off the acid spray technique to see that the liquid had burned a hole in his opponent's black cloak and had apparently started eating through his hardened skin. Good, I have a chance. Go now. He hissed to Gaara. The Sunanin nodded in response, slipping silently past the Akatsuki nin while the larger man was distracted. If I keep him in here, I won't have to worry about Kirisain. I guess you've got some tricks up your sleeve to make you worth something, huh? Whatever. Doton, Genshūso. Thick pillars of rock shot out from the cave's walls, floor, and ceiling at random locations, forcing the brunette to contort his body around each obstacle. One clipped his shoulder, throwing him off balance, and a second one slammed into his stomach, knocking the breath from his lungs. The slime covering his skin allowed him to slide off the stone before it could crush him against the wall, and Utakata sent a mental plea to the Bijū sealed within him. Saiken, I need your chakra. I don't think I can take the Oinin and two of Akatsuki if we don't get out of here before that other guy comes back. Likely not, burbled the slug, but be careful. I know. Chakra exploded out of him, disguising his form in an amorphous, oblong-shaped blob of mixed red and black. 5 equally oblong tails trailed from the base of his spine, and Utakata oozed through the spaces between the columns created by the rock pillar spear's technique, body flattening and flowing as if boneless. He made it to the front of the cave, where Tsurugi and Kansuchi had started trading blows, the Akatsuki nin fending off the mist shinobi with a large broadsword and darkened skin. Tsurugi caught sight of him approaching, movements stalling as he gasped, "Rokubi." Then the broadsword cleaved through his torso, and the Oinin's body fell into 2 pieces. A sliver of sympathy trickled through Utakata, which quickly changed to trepidation as the Akatsuki nin turned to face him. "So, you're a Jinchūriki, huh?" If that was in the bingo book, Kakuzu sure kept it close to his chest. Probably didn't want to step on Zetsu's toes, or whatever that freak's got for feet. Guess he'll just have to take the nibby. He swung the blade at the Kirinin, and Utakata dove under the slash, fluidly avoiding the weapon and lashing his tails around the base of the blade, holding it in place. His acidic skin began to eat through the metal, but with a hard yank, the sword slid from his grasp, cutting through the tips of his tails and eliciting a pained roar. Kansuchi's leg kicked out, and Utakata grabbed the man's ankle, focusing on the acid covering his hands. The earth spear technique dissolved under his hold, but a block of stone burst from the floor, forcing him to release the older male or risk being brained. Utakata sat on his haunches and observed his adversary, drool leaking from his open maw to erode the stone it dripped on. Kairokyu! A cloud of white gas billowed from the transformed Jinchūriki's mouth, engulfing the space between them and turning the broadsword into puddled steel. Kansuchi immediately released the hilt of his blade, sacrificing it to the wisdom wolf decay, and leaped from the cave to the open air, where the vapor was more likely to disperse. Utakata slithered through his own technique, hiding in its midst, until he was close enough to stretch out his tails and wrap them around the Akatsuki nin like a constrictor, bringing the brunt of his acidic skin against his enemy's hardened one. Hiruma! Kansuchi's dark skin began to erode beneath the touch of the leech gap technique. He grunted in pain, flexing against the renegade mist shinobi and supplementing his form with rock until the Jinchūriki's body was stretched to its limit. A roar spilled from the teenager's throat, acid building in his esophagus, but the Akatsuki nin moved close enough to grab his head with a stone-encased fist, tightly squeezing heedless of the acid dissolving his defenses. With a transformation of his chakra, Utakata slipped from his enemy's grasp, body contorting like an eel, and swung his tails like a bat. Kansuchi grabbed them with both arms, reinforced with rocky armor, just before impact, then lifted the Jinchūriki into an arc and slammed him against the ground with a bellow. Dust billowed around them, and when it cleared, a hole could be seen where the teenager's body had lain. The Akatsuki nin's hands shed their stone gauntlets to blaze through seals, palms slapping against the earth with a grunted, "Doton, Kaido Shokutsu." The ground formed into a gigantic anthill, a heatless volcano that shot the demonic boy forth amid a cavalcade of dirt and pale green liquid. Kansuchi hissed and fortified his earth spear technique as acid rained down like lava and ash, the liquid eating through leaves, wood, earth, and skin indiscriminately. Then the bulk of the deluge crashed down with the weight of a tsunami, engulfing the once peaceful grotto in burning fluid. Utakata's trajectory continued through the air unimpeded, the momentum of the open earth rising excavation technique combined with the mist shinobi's expelled chakra sending him soaring far from the battlefield. By the time Kakuzu returned from dispatching the remaining Oinin squad members, the Rokubi's acid had left smoking ruins in a small pocket of the land of rivers. Kansuchi laid in a crater that had a depleting volume of acid seeping through the ground, chunks of flesh eaten out of his body, both feet burned off by the pool of liquid. This was unforeseen. His partner's gaze turned towards him, angry red splotches on his face identifying where the acid had burned him, mouth opening and closing slowly in an attempt at speech. "You're still alive. How fortuitous." He raised an arm and black threads wriggled out from a suture that kept his forearm tied to his elbow. They wrapped themselves under Kansuchi's armpits and dragged the man's body out of the pit, setting him on the flat earth before digging under his skin, eliciting a choked sound from the prone shinobi. When the tendrils emerged, the Akatsuki nin's heart was in their grasp, pulsing a thready beat, and then they returned to Kakuzu's body, assimilating the organ. Kakuzu's green eyes fluttered closed for a brief moment as he absorbed his now-deceased partner's power. He raised his hand and activated the earth spear technique, watching his skin darken to a deep pitch in mimicry of Kansuchi's specialty. "Worry not, Kansuchi, you shall live on, if in spirit rather than body. I suppose that will not be sufficient to prevent pain from finding me another partner." Green eyes roved towards the untouched cave entrance, where a body lay protected under its roof. He strolled over and stared down at the torso and head of the Oinen Tsurugi. At least you achieved your goal. With no effort, he slung the top half of the kirinin over his shoulder and then walked back over to his former partner. It seems you didn't get Utakata, but I think you should serve as a sufficient replacement. He grabbed the corpse's black cloak and lugged him over the other shoulder, both bodies a minimal inconvenience for his 6-foot frame. With one last glance around the area, Kakuzu left the destruction behind, 2 high-class bounties on his back. Utakata reclined against the trunk of a sturdy tree and took a deep breath that racked his body. The momentum of the opening earth-rising excavation technique had carried his transformed form away, where he'd crashed into an unknown area of woods in a shower of acid and debris. His vat of acid technique had at least taken effect, and would hopefully keep Akatsuki distracted long enough for him to recover and rendezvous with Gaara and Fu. Despite the genial relationship he'd nurtured with the Rokubi, tapping into a significant amount of the gastropod's chakra always left him in a weakened state. He wasn't Yagura, with unquestionable control over his Bijū, nor was he Han, who could apparently utilize the Five Tails chakra on a whim with little to no consequences. He let out a groan, hanging his head as another spasm shuddered down his spine. Well, this has gone pear-shaped, he muttered. And to think, all he'd wanted was to find Kiba. You are okay. Utakata looked up to find Gaara standing before him, expression as inscrutable as ever. Fu was approaching at a slog behind him, appearing only slightly less out of sorts than when he'd last seen her. You got away, he said, breathing a sigh of relief. The redhead nodded, offering the older boy his kimono, and the kirinin took it, asking, Are you okay? Gaara followed the older male's gaze to Fu, and after several seconds of non-responsiveness from the kunoichi, intoned, We are physically unharmed. Utakata nodded, but continued to scrutinize the Nanabai Jinchūriki. Fu, what happened back there? That was Kakuzu, she finally whispered. She still seemed traumatized, but the fact that she was talking now was reassuring. He's from Takigakure. I read about him in a book. He was imprisoned for failing to assassinate the Shodai Hokage. The Shodai Hokage? The kirinin interjected, stunned. That can't be possible. He would be almost 100 years old. I can't explain that part, Fu admitted, but it was definitely him. He had a Taki hideate, and his eyes, I would recognize them anywhere. There was a mugshot of him from when he was imprisoned. The story goes that he broke out and murdered the village elders, but no one knows how. Kakuzu's the best and worst shinobi Taki ever produced. He's scary, Su. Silence reigned among the trio as Fu's shaky words were digested. Utakata decided to break it, saying, Well, we know more now about Akatsuki than we did before. And we made it out alive. I think we should consider this a win. Then we are to continue. You seem indisposed. Yeah, are you sure you're okay, Su? Your chakra feels tired. It's Saiken, Utakata explained, dragging himself to his feet and gesturing with his head that they could keep moving. The Rokubi. We're compatible, but we haven't gotten to the point where I can use his chakra in excess without being unaffected. Compatible? Gaara's dry timbre sounded almost curious. Utakata spared him a glance, golden eyes flickering over to Fu, whose expression seemed to match the redhead's tone. Right, I keep forgetting you guys don't really know what it's like to be a Bijū container. The power of the Bijū cannot be contained by just anyone. Their individual chakra have to be compatible, otherwise the host will reject the Bijū, and, well, so. Gaara stated, absorbing the older boy's explanation, we were destined to carry these burdens. The kirinin opened his mouth to respond and, not for the first time, found himself at a loss for words. We never had a chance for a happy life, did we? Utakata grappled for some way to relieve Fu's melancholy, finally managing it. We can't change the past. We can only move forward from here and live good lives, irrespective of the cards we've been dealt. Gaara grunted, an indecipherable noise. You sound like Naruto. Maybe you learned it from Utakata and I. Fu suggested. The brunette shot her a surprised look, startled by the familial address, and received a shy smile in response. He offered her a smile of his own, glad for a definitive sign of the forgiveness he'd been seeking from the green-haired girl for untold weeks. I think Naruto's optimism is inherent, he responded, bemused, but I appreciate your faith in me. You're our leader, Fu chirped, cheer nearly drowning out Gaara's intoned agreement. That simple sentiment pushed their conversation into a companionable silence, Utakata humbled once more by the other's admission, and the trio continued their trek unhurried through the land of rivers. The brunette's energy slowly returned as they traveled, posture straightening into a semblance of its usual ramrod. By the time the lush foliage of the land of rivers thinned to reveal a series of more barren, rocky steppes framed by dark mountains, the sun had passed its zenith, and Utakata, sad as it sounded, felt a little more at home, the desolate atmosphere a nostalgic reminder of the hidden mist village. If this is where Raiga made his home, I can see why. Why? Fu's curiosity carried the same genuine warmth as Naruto's, and Utakata felt himself smile in spite of the bittersweet atmosphere. Well, this place isn't so dissimilar from Kirigakure. Not everyone who leaves their village wants to escape it. This place is kinda gloomy, Utakata and I. It's not Takigakure, that's for sure, he agreed, shooting the green-haired girl a glance. Her upbeat facade faded, replaced with something more pensive, and the brunette realized he'd erred with his glibness. I'm sorry, I didn't mean, I was referring to the climate, not that the people there are any better than, he cut himself off and sighed, annoyed by his own rambling. Sorry, it's okay Sue. I get it. She took a deep breath. You're right. We need to keep moving forward. Gaara's disaffected rasp interrupted their conversation. There is a town below. The other two Jinchūriki stepped closer to where the redhead stood on the road's edge, stoic gaze fixated on the civilization hugging the mountainside. That could be it, Utakata said. They traversed a winding road built into the mountains that led down towards the village, a thin gloom growing around them as they descended. It was almost a surprise when they finally caught sight of a residence up close, its inhabitant outside taking down laundry. Oh, visitors. How unusual. Utakata stepped forward. Yes, sorry for intruding. This might be a bit of an odd question, but have you heard the name Raiga before? The woman nodded. It's familiar, yes. I believe that was the name of the man who took over Katabami Kinzen. The stories we heard from there. Is that where we are? She laughed then, genuinely amused by the question. Goodness no. This is Katabami Ginzen. Katabami Kinzen is further ahead. If you go back up this trail and then continue walking for, maybe another half day, you'll come across it. Utakata sketched a hasty bow. Apologies if I caused offense. Thank you for your help. The woman waved him off. Not a problem. Such a polite young man. Embarrassed, the brunette took a step backwards to rejoin his companions, gesturing for them to follow him back up the mountainside and offering the woman his final murmured gratitude. He could feel the younger Jinchūriki's eyes on his back as they ascended, and when they were finally well out of earshot of the residents of Katabami Ginzen, Fu commented, "You're so good with people, Utakata and I." The Kirinine let out an awkward chuckle. You think so? Rashi calls it pandering. He doesn't really care about being nice, does he? He's unused to dealing with people, Utakata hedged, obligated to defend their companion but mentally conceding that the green-haired girl wasn't wrong. I don't think he likes accepting that people have to rely on other people. Gaara made a non-committal noise that had the other two Jinchūriki turning to look at him. You don't agree? The redhead seemed to stare straight through him, teal eyes intense but unfocused. In my experience, he uttered slowly, people. He trailed off, lost in some unknown thought. Utakata and Fu exchanged glances when his silence continued to drag, and the kunoichi prompted, Gaara? The redhead shook his head slowly, as if awakening from a dream. Are complicated. Teal eyes finally focused on the pairs of orange and gold that stared at him with varying degrees of concern and apprehension. Once, I would have agreed with Rashi, but circumstances have changed. I do not believe I can judge. You're still allowed an opinion, Utakata said. Perhaps, the Sunanin acquiesced after a moment's thought, but it would not be well informed. Utakata hummed in thought, letting his attention fall off the younger boy. He's complicated. But he was also careful, thoughtful, traits not too dissimilar from the Kirinine himself. There, at least, was a non-depressing thread of commonality between them. It only took a couple hours of walking for Fu to comment that she could sense another congregation of weak chakra, likely Katabami Kinzen. With careful direction, she navigated them toward its heart, their long years of training cutting the woman's estimated arrival time by a fraction. Gaara, head slowly swiveling like a pendulum to take in the geography, pointed out a sign that identified the village as their target, and Utakata felt a surge of optimism fill his chest. Fu, can you sense anything? Maybe. There's something that has a pretty different chakra than everything else, Sue. It's weird. That sounds promising. Where is it? Fu pointed down, deep into the bowels of the rocky valleys, where swirling mists hid their depths from sight. Somewhere down there. Worth a shot. He brought his bamboo blower to his lips and exhaled a large bubble, casting a glance at the two younger Jinchūriki. I think this should be quicker, if you're willing. Yeah! Fu cheered, and her response prompted the brunette to create another drifting bubble before turning his attention to Gaara. I will remain here. If you're sure. With that, Utakata stepped into his bubble, Fu mimicking his actions with the second one he'd created. A wave of his hand sent them floating down into the abyss, and Utakata felt a sliver of trepidation as the air around them grew thick, reminded uncomfortably of being surrounded by oinin and inhibited by the mist rain technique. He looked over and spotted Fu with her hands splayed against the bubble, glee stretching her lips wide as they descended. Her blatant joy alleviated some of his apprehension, and the Kirinin felt himself relax. He focused on controlling their descent, the fog thinning out as they neared the bottom to reveal a stream cutting through the gray landscape. The two drifting bubbles burst with a quiet pop, and both Jinchūriki turned to gaze at the clusters of rock scattered around them. Fu started walking towards one of the piles and Utakata followed behind, trusting the kunoichi's sensory abilities. She stopped suddenly and turned to face him, expression solemn. Utakata closed the distance between them and looked down at a scattering of charred bones, most blackened to pitch. Is that? Fu began. The Kirinin nodded to her unfinished question, golden eyes fixated on Raiga's remains, and Fu stepped to the side and bent down. Hey, Utakata and this what you're looking for? In her hands were two 3-foot swords, thin blades ending in leather hilts. Two short, curved protrusions, one near the hilt, one near the tip, oriented opposite each other, stuck out from each blade like fangs, giving the weapons their namesake. Utakata nodded mutely, taking the proffered weapons and wincing as a prickle of electricity, perhaps Kiba's innate lightning-natured chakra, danced down his fingertips, through his arms, and to his feet. It felt vaguely familiar, a memory from his childhood long buried. Utakata and Aisu. He blinked out of his trance, meeting Fu's concerned orange gaze. He must have lost track of things in the nostalgia of handling his father's blades. Yes, sorry. Yes, this is exactly what I was looking for. He offered her a small upturn of his lips. Thank you, Fu. She smiled back, shy, embarrassed, and the brunette took that as his cue to create another set of drifting bubbles that brought them back to where they'd left Gaara. The bubbles popped, and the redhead greeted them with a bland, "Did you find what you sought?" Utakata held up the blades for his scrutiny, a thin bolt of lightning crackling between the two fangs of one sword. Gaara flinched, teal eyes widening for a moment as he stepped away, breathing suddenly ragged, and when he spoke again, it was in a harsher-than-normal rasp. You must be relieved. Pleased, actually, replied the Kirinin, tucking the blades back into his obi. Are you okay? You seem fine, Gaara said, and his voice had returned to its normal timbre. There was a pause, then, Inoichi says healing requires honesty. I have learned that lightning is deserved respect. Utakata nodded. Wise words. Their journey back to Konoha was done in a roundabout, sedate manner, Utakata, perhaps overly so, cautious of running across any Akatsuki members who might still be skulking around the land of rivers. From behind him, Fu kept her focus on their surroundings, stretching her sensing abilities to their limit so they would have advance notice of any interlopers. Gaara, at the rear following a night of guard duty while his two companions rested, was observing the natural world around them, teal-eyes curious at each tree, bird, and mammal they came across. Eventually, the mist renegade slowed his pace to drop behind Fu, drawing even with Gaara and asking, "What are you doing?" For almost a minute, the redhead's eyes remained fixed on the leafy boughs of some towering tree. Then he turned to Utakata and said, "Life is strange. Plants and animals exist in a balance that humans lack." Teal eyes returned to their surroundings, pointing with a rigid arm to one of several trees ahead and to the left. That is a coast redwood. It is very young, as they can grow in excess of 200 feet. The bark holds large quantities of water. He gestured around, as if referencing the land of rivers around them, which affords protection from forest fires. They have existed for millennia, and have evolved to resist fungi and insect infestation. The land of wind isn't exactly known for its foliage, Utakata observed. I'm impressed you know all that. I have taken to reading in my spare time. He turned dead-set eyes on Utakata, the dark rings that marked his sleep deprivation making the teal coloring all the more prominent. Of which I have much. Utakata nodded, conceding the point. What else have you learned? Gaara's slow monotone began, a litany of strange, seemingly useless knowledge about the passing flora and fauna that the brunette listened to with polite interest. It was surreal to hear the normally quiet boy speak, especially for long periods of time, and the Kirinine was admittedly curious to hear what could keep the Sunanine's interest. Fu slowed down to listen as well, the pair asking questions to keep their companion talking. When his voice eventually grew hoarse, beyond its normal desert dry rasp, Fu took over, describing some of her studies from the hidden waterfall, all innocuous topics, with a heavy focus on the hero tree that was a centerpiece of the village. Utakata eventually jumped in, sharing his own stories of being brought up in the hidden mist. It was fascinating, he mused as they traded stories, how they were bonding over the most inconsequential things, the topics completely separate from the one thing that did bind them, their status as Jinchūriki. It was probably better that way, given what a depressing thread of commonality that was. By the time their voices were raw, darkness had fallen, and Utakata called for another night's rest. Their fourth day of travel passed in relative silence, and by mid-afternoon, Fu indicated that she could sense Konoha in the distance. Heartened by the announcement, the trio agreed to pick up their pace, moving into an easy gait that left no room for conversation. Dusk was settling in when the Hidden Leaf's great walls came into view, and Utakata came to a sudden halt outside them, the two younger Jinchūriki skidding to a stop beside him. Utakata and I. He turned to face them, expression earnest. I just wanted to thank you both for coming with me. I know that you may not understand how much this means to me, but I don't think I could have done this without you both, and I know that you had no personal investment in my mission. He bowed deeply to them, a gesture he was sure neither had ever received before. So thank you. I'm in your debt. Utakata and I, you saved me from Taki when I thought I had nothing. When I was nothing. And now I'm here, and I've got you, and Naruto, and Gaara. She paused, perhaps thinking of whether to include the two IWA Jinchūriki, and simply continued, we only have each other, right Su? Utakata glanced at Gaara, half expecting the redhead to say something, but the Sunanine only cocked his head to the side and blinked once. If the several days of camaraderie had taught him anything, he took that to mean the younger boy agreed with the Kunoichi's assessment. He offered them a smile and another murmur of gratitude, even though it was apparently unnecessary. If there's any fallout with the Hokage, I'll take the heat. He got matching nods of assent before leading them through the gate and immediately being accosted by Anbu, one of which stated, "You're to come with us." I assumed. They were taken to the Senju complex, where Utakata was led away, leaving Fu and Gaara alone in the foyer. Will he be okay? Fu asked. Gaara made a non-committal noise. One assumes. He received a nod in return. Okay Su. I'm gonna go to bed. See you in the morning. Sleep well, Gaara offered. Left alone, he gravitated to his usual nighttime haunt, finding a moon on the cusp of being full looking down on him. He stared at it for a long time, musing on Utakata's unfamiliar gratitude, especially towards him. It was novel, being appreciated, especially for something beyond the purpose he'd originally been created for. He hummed to himself, intrigued by the prospect. Sabaka no Gaara. We found you at last. Gaara turned his head in the direction of the unfamiliar, masculine voice, and then saw nothing but darkness. That's it for part 6. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.